Ever since its release, I have been in love with Death Stranding. It's become something of a comfort game for me over the past few years, and I'll always find myself coming back to it on an annual basis. It has helped me through some tough times, and the game will always hold a special place in my heart. So when I heard about a sequel releasing to a game that is so special to me, I was beyond excited. I anxiously anticipated its release as the months passed, as I couldn't wait to get my hands on it. Which is why it brings me no joy in saying that Death Stranding 2 is a disappointment in almost every aspect aside from its presentation. That's not to say if you like this game for any other reason, then you're wrong, because obviously you're not. This video is not meant to bash the people who love Death Stranding 2, but rather a video talking about my experience with Death Stranding 2 and the issues I've encountered with it. To help with the pacing of the video, I've decided to split the video into two different sections, where I talk about the gameplay and the narrative. Originally, I wanted to talk about them both simultaneously, but whenever I would try to make the two interconnect, it wouldn't flow very well. Of course, it goes without saying there will be spoilers for both of the Death Stranding games, so if you haven't completed either of them yet, this will be your final warning before we jump into it. So now's your chance to click off. Also, big thanks to Red Velas for his help on the video. He's also made a Death Stranding 2 video of his own, so if you like this video and want to see more of this kind of content, then I recommend checking him and his Death Stranding 2 video out. Now let's get back to the real meat and potatoes of this video. Full spoilers ahead in 3, 2, 1. One of the main things I look for in a sequel to a game, especially one that focuses heavily on its narrative, is whether it can justify its own existence. There are many examples I can give, however, no matter how many games I try to think of, the first game that always pops into my head is Portal 2. While the game keeps its already pre-established gameplay mechanics, it still manages to find ways to expand upon them, making use of these simplistic mechanics and exploiting them to their full advantage, making it more difficult, yet still keeping its identity intact. Portal 2 is everything you loved about the first one, but more of it. This is what we call a safe sequel, because while Portal 2 doesn't do anything that redefines their game or breaks gaming conventions, it doesn't need to. After having played Death Stranding 2 5 times, I would also call it a safe sequel. However, what separates Death Stranding 2 from Portal 2 is what it does to justify its existence. So I'll stop beating around the bush and start elaborating on why that's the case. For Death Stranding 2, Sam's mission is to link up the entirety of Australia. Failing to do so would result in the extinction of humanity, which is something I already take issue with. In Death Stranding 1, the game has the huge task of trying to sell you on why it is so important to hook up America. Many of the themes and the story as a whole is very closely connected to the history of America and its politics. Modern America likes to call itself the world's greatest country, and Death Stranding serves as a warning on the loss of power, but as a way to partially respond to Trump's claims that you shouldn't block any person out, that separating ourselves only leads to more problems, and by connecting with each other, will we ultimately achieve unity, which will serve as a step in the right direction. Of course, this doesn't just apply to Trump, but you get the idea. One of the main reasons why Death Stranding worked is not just because of the characters, but because it tried to get you to care about the goal itself. Without it, those themes of connection would be a lot less important, because if there's no rhyme or reason to linking up America, then why should I care at all? This is a pit that the sequel falls into, and never manages to dig its way out of. The main reason we need to hook up Australia is that by putting Australia on the chiral network, it will open up more plate gates, allowing Drawbridge to expand their network further, which in turn will save humanity. However, we aren't given a reason as to why Australia is so important. Australia only serves as the template for yet another country to hook up, and if this were any other game, I would give it a pass. But since Death Stranding's whole thing is why culture and people are so important, the fact that there is a severe lack of cultural importance to hooking up Australia is odd. Instead of being a main factor in the plot of the story, it is merely reduced to a background character within the narrative. I'm not saying that I need some deep, complex lore about Australia, but it would be nice to give me a reason to care about this country at all. Because of this, it gives Death Stranding 2 an excuse to repeat the same plot all over again without needing to change a whole lot. In fact, the entire story is essentially the same as the first, but worse. In both games, Sam is tasked with linking up a country, all while getting visions of a mysterious figure that he isn't aware of just yet, but will retroactively change him after finding out all about them. All while a massive government conspiracy lingers in the background, as we find out that a character important to us is in fact an extinction entity. Higgs, our central protagonist of the story, is convinced that humanity needs to be wiped clean, and Sam needs to stop Higgs from going through with his plan. I could draw more comparisons, but you get the idea. Now let's get one thing straight. Is it bad for games to repeat and/or loop the same narrative? Well, it's complicated. Take the Uncharted series as an example. Every single game in the franchise practically has the exact same story, where our central protagonist, Nathan Drake, is on the hunt for a treasure that the antagonist of the story is also after. But by the end of the story, Nathan Drake gives up on the pursuit of said treasure in favor of some moral lesson he learns by the end of the game. You could literally apply this to any Uncharted story and it would fit perfectly. So why does Uncharted get a pass for this, but Death Stranding 2 doesn't? Well, to put it simply, Uncharted is not about the story as a whole, it's about the characters. The game uses the plot as a means to flesh out the characters and develop them. On the other hand, Death Stranding is more concerned with telling an overly convoluted story, whilst also developing the characters too. There's no purpose or need for Death Stranding 2 to have a repeating plot, since at the end of the day, there's no discernible point for needing the game to take place in Australia. There's not any real point for a lot of the game's repetition, and it doesn't have Uncharted's excuse to fall back on. You could argue that the Metal Gear Solid games fall into the exact same category, but again, Metal Gear Solid uses its plot to go deeper and explore more subtle themes within the story, but Death Stranding ultimately has none of that. There are a lot of themes, there are a lot of messages within the game, but none of them are developed well enough that would justify the repetition of the plot. I'll concede that there are some minor differences between the two games in their story. However, the base premise remains exactly the same. While it only makes sense that there may be some overlap in its plot, the fact is that it is concerning for a story to have this much of it. But maybe I'm jumping the gun here. I haven't even begun to talk about the specifics of the story yet, and I'm already concluding that the narrative is a meaningless repeat. So let's break it down. The game takes place 11 months after the events of the first game, with Sam and Lou now on the run from Bridges as they try to live a life in isolation. Fragile manages to track them down due to the chiral network increasingly expanding, and offers Sam a choice to either continue the way he's going, or help her get New Mexico on the network. In doing so, Sam's record will be expunged, and when Sam hears this, he takes it, which feels quite out of character for him. This deal only extends to Sam, so they would still be trying to take Lou from Sam, even if his record has been cleared. In fact, Sam even questions if the deal extends to Lou.
What about Lou?
That's a little more complicated. We're talking about a Bridges asset. You'll have to work it out.
And that's all he says. Now remember, the reason why Sam ran away with Lou in the first place was to protect her after Bridges had been so stingy about letting Sam keep her. In fact, there's a whole portion of the game that details how Bridges would not allow Sam to keep her. The second game even confirms this for us.
Since it's functionally impossible for the UCA or Bridges to track a BB of which they have no record. Which is lucky because if they did know about a BB that could live and grow outside the pod, they'd want to secure it for study.
But before any of you tell me that Deadman tells us that our BB doesn't have a serial number, so it's a-okay, this is after Sam decided to accept Fragile's mission to hook up all of New Mexico, which means that Sam's characterization here is still questionable. Lou is the only thing that matters to Sam, and that much is clear to us in the section that takes place immediately after Sam thinks Lou is dead. So Sam doing this mission with no guarantee that Lou will be safe is weird. What's even weirder is how willing Sam is to take this mission on. Sam doesn't even think about it for more than a minute before deciding to go out and connect New Mexico to the chiral network. A couple things to gather from this is that while hooking up New Mexico is seemingly the goal of the game, it's revealed to be more of a tutorial level than anything else for the player to get adjusted to some new additions to the gameplay that I'll speak on later. The next few hours of gameplay and story follow a very similar formula to Death Stranding 1 of delivering packages and getting used to the new controls, whilst introducing new items. Things are quite samey until we reach Deadman, who passes away, but not before telling us why Australia needs to be hooked up. We've already talked about this enough though, so we'll just skim past it. As a reward for hooking up all of New Mexico, we will now have our record expunged, and on our way back, we encounter a robot samurai whose reasons for why they've helped us are unknown. This turns out to be Deadman and is actually one of the better plot twists within Death Stranding 2. However, I still take issue with Die Hard Man and the Red Samurai not being able to reveal their identity. In the game, it is established that the reason why Deadman couldn't reveal he was alive to the crew in the game was due to the fact that APAS was listening in. That makes sense for Charlie, as he is constantly stuck on board the ship in the DHV. However, the same cannot be said for the Red Samurai, as he is able to move around freely without much consequence. And yet, Die Hardman doesn't even try to communicate with Sam with this technology. If for whatever reason he can't speak, then he can always try other methods of communication to let Sam know of what is really going on. Another thing that is confusing to me is how rarely the Red Samurai actually appears within the narrative, especially for the amount of time Sam is in trouble. Why didn't the Red Samurai help with any of the bosses, or with any of the plot elements within the game? While the Red Samurai is portrayed to be a figure who helps out whenever you are in trouble, it seems that he only appears when the plot wants him to be there. It's not like there is any real limit to what he can do, so this just confuses me. As we arrive back to the base, we find out that it had been ransacked, and that Lou is dead, and Fragile is, well, it's complicated, with both Fragile and Lou, actually. To put it simply, when Higgs tried killing Fragile, she was in the middle of beach jumping, meaning that her Ha and her Ka were separated, because time works differently on the beach, which means it allowed her physical form to continue a little while longer. This is all well and good, although I'm not quite sure how I feel about Fragile having amnesia. Let me get one thing clear, I do not hate amnesia as a plot device within media. Just because it is an overused trope, that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. There is a reason why amnesia is used so often in storytelling, and that's because when done correctly, it can be used to deepen our connection to the characters, instead of being used as some cheap mystery box. What I actively dislike about the fact that Fragile is now an amnesiac and cannot remember is the fact that we get little to no character development with her. We never see her having any heart-to-hearts with Sam, and if we do, they are often extremely brief. We get a small one right after Lou gets killed, but not really. We also get a couple lines from her where she expresses some amount of guilt or sorrow, but that's honestly not enough for me. It also feels slightly out of character for Fragile to not even try to open up with any of these characters, or Sam, about how she feels about her guilt for not being able to save Lou. In the first game, she practically tortured herself over the fact that she was both demonized and idolized for what happened with Higgs, and you can tell it really weighed on her. This eventually leads to a heart-to-heart she has with Sam, where she talks about what really happened between her and Higgs. In this game, you'd think that the events of the trauma would correlate to what happened with Higgs, and would lead to her having her own struggles throughout the game, but it never happens, and it leaves Fragile in this weird limbo zone where she does nothing but exposit plot points for a good 90% of the game, until the end when she is needed by the plot again just for her to die. But since she is given basically no character at all for a good portion of the game, when it's time for her to die, I don't care. There's no meat for me to chew on that would allow me to care about her. She's totally static until the end of the game. The same could be said for every other character in all honesty, but we'll talk about that more later when we get to it. There's also this weird romance scene with Fragile and Sam that they randomly decide to shoehorn in the final few minutes of the game for whatever reason. Maybe I find it weird because I see everyone within the DHV Mellin as more of a family than potential romantic interests for Sam, especially Fragile of all people. They barely had any romantic tension between the two in the first game, none in the second, and now you want me to believe that they are in love now? Not to say that I'm against the idea, it's just that it is implemented so poorly because there have been no signs of their relationship heading this way in the second game. So when it does happen, it feels like it came out of nowhere. I also feel like it's a missed opportunity for the game to try and hide the reveal of Lou being tomorrow. I actually wish that we got the reveal a whole lot sooner, to hone in those themes of connection with Sam reconnecting with tomorrow, and the end of the game dealing with Higgs and the fallout of said event. But instead we get something even more odd. Something that ruins the twist of Tomorrow being Lou and Fragile forgetting all about it is the fact that we get barely any scenes where Sam and Tomorrow interact. Sure, they are occasionally in the same room with each other, but never once do we get any character moments or scenes with the two of them where they interact. So by the time it is revealed that Lou is in fact Tomorrow, the payoff is not nearly as strong as it was intended to be. I do not care for Tomorrow, but I care for Lou, and the reason for that is that I had so many moments with Lou as a character in the first game that I started to become attached to Lou by the end. With Tomorrow, I couldn't care less about her, and in turn that weakens the amnesia plot with Fragile, as there is no purpose for it. It just comes across as something that is there for having some artificial mystery in exchange for contrived drama, rather than ultimately serving a purpose. Which brings me to Sam's character. In the first game, Sam is a reclusive individual who doesn't like talking to others and has a phobia of being touched. He's essentially a silent protagonist who changes throughout the story and becomes more connected to the characters. By the end of the game, Sam has his own found family, thus completing his arc, going from a reclusive figure to one that enjoys other people's company. In Death Stranding 2, Sam is forced to grieve the loss of Lou and face some harsh realities. For a sequel, this is a fine direction to put your character in. However, there's a couple of issues I have with how Death Stranding 2 executes this story thread. I think that one of the main issues being the incongruity between the story and gameplay of how Lou's death is felt. As soon as Lou died, I thought it would be quite interesting to see how the gameplay would change without her, since she was such a major factor into the gameplay for the first game. So after her death, the gameplay changes would surely be immense. Unfortunately, that isn't exactly the case, as all the gameplay remains practically the same, and I'm not saying that now that Lou is dead, everything about the gameplay needs to change, but I would prefer if there was at least something that would serve as more of a challenge in the gameplay because of Lou's absence. Not to mention the emotional moments of the story feel like they are constantly interrupted by the formulaic structure of the gameplay. The game doesn't give us much in the way of letting Sam and the player breathe for a bit, as the second we wake up, we are immediately on the grind. In fact, Sam feels even more like a husk in this game than the previous one, and I don't mean that in the sense that he's grieving, I mean that he doesn't react to things in the way that he should be reacting to them, and at times it kind of ruins my investment. For example, later on in the story, Sam is getting burned alive by Higgs, and when he gets saved by Fragile, Rainey, and Tomorrow, he shows no signs of anger or resentment towards Higgs. He just continues on like nothing ever happened. Not to mention the weird fact that he doesn't confront anyone about anything. I get Sam is antisocial and doesn't like talking to people, but he has come a long way since the beginning of Death Stranding 1, and I feel like there are at least a few things that he should raise his eyebrow on. Like when he finds out about A-Pass, he doesn't confront Fragile on why they'd need him anymore. He kinda goes along with it without questioning a thing. Yeah, okay buddy. I mean, I guess it wouldn't be the first time in the game that Sam does something weirdly out of character, so I suppose it's not all that surprising Sam doesn't question a whole lot of what happens. Hell, even when it is revealed that Lou is Tomorrow, the daughter that he has been grieving for the entirety of the game, the most he has to say is...
Yeah.
Yeah? Fuck you mean, yeah? Your daughter's come back from the dead and the only thing you can muster up is yeah? Speaking of which, the reveal of Lou being Tomorrow kind of ruins the arc that Sam goes through when grieving her supposed death, because she was alive this whole time, which kind of undercuts the message of Sam's arc. Although it wasn't really much of an arc to begin with, Sam hardly interacts with any of the characters, and while I think that is reasonable for someone who is dealing with grief, I find it weird how hardly any of the characters try to get Sam to talk to them other than some quick 30-second scene that has more to do with what the characters themselves are up to rather than Sam. Surprisingly, it's Dollman who manages to have the most heartfelt conversation with Sam about grief, and even then the conversation is completely one-sided.
You know, I meant it when I said I understand how you feel, but if you hold on to the sadness, it will weigh you down like an anchor. However much it hurts, you must carry on and do what only you can do. Grieve, of course. But keep moving, Sam. Then, when all is said and done, you can take stock and decide what's next.
I'll touch on Tamara a little more later on in the video, but the main takeaway you should get from my experience with her character is very disappointing and underdeveloped like everyone else in the game. In Sam's state of grief, Fragile manages to convince Sam to do one more mission, to hook up all of Australia in hopes that this venture will help Sam cope with Lou's death. I think all of this is fine. Sam begrudgingly going along with Fragile makes sense for Sam's character to do, as the only other thing he can do is try to kill himself and fail. While it is fine, I would have preferred more scenes like this, where we can fully explore Sam's grief, but I already touched on that earlier, so I won't harp on that too much. As we get briefed on the mission details, we are introduced to the DHV Mellin. This is Sam's room, where you'll be spending approximately 50% of the game. You like it? Well, you better, because otherwise you'll get sick of it very quickly. The DHV segments have got to be one of the biggest missed opportunities in Death Stranding 2. The environments are way too cramped for the game to justify spamming this room over and over throughout the game. And before anyone brings up the private rooms in the first game, while they were all identical, they were not spammed this much throughout the course of Death Stranding 1. They were spaced out just enough to the point where you didn't get too sick of them, and were very rarely required for you to use them in order to progress the story. But in Death Stranding 2, it is completely different. Almost every mission you complete, Fragile orders you to come back to the DHV Mellin, and after the 6th or 7th time you do this, it gets old pretty fast, as there is no benefit to being forced into the DHV. Most of the time you sleep, wake up, and then leave to deliver more packages. On occasion, it will be used to trigger certain cutscenes, but for the majority of the game, it is there for nothing more than pointless filler. They do try to make it more interesting as the game progresses, but it isn't enough for me to stop getting sick of the same repetitive environment with barely anything to do. Sorry Kojima, but the option to change what color I want my wallpaper to be is not going to make my experience any less dull. And the thing that frustrates me the most is if they had made some slight changes to the design of the DHV as a whole, it would be a lot more bearable, and I wouldn't have as much of a problem with it. For example, early on the game hints that in the future, there will be more interactables that may be important to the story or knowledge of the characters as a whole, but this is never really developed further in any meaningful way. And it's disappointing, because on paper, the idea of finding certain missable items that could develop the characters is really neat. But after having finished my 5th playthrough, I haven't seen them do it again after they attempted to do it the first time. Which kind of upsets me, because had they committed to the idea, I would have complimented the DHV environment for being a lot more interactive than it actually is. However, even if they had committed to the idea, it wouldn't save the game from having undercooked characters. Fun fact about this completely missable character beat, is that it is the only moment in the game that properly fleshes out Tarman. So if you miss it, well then good luck finding any other character development for Tarman other than maybe a couple lines that reference his missing arm, because you aren't getting any. This is what I mean when I say that this is a cool idea on paper, because in order for it to work, the characters actually need to be developed. If the only way I can get a proper moment of development is through gameplay that is completely missable, then that's not only bad game design, but terrible writing. One slightly nitpicky thing I will mention is the incentive of showering in Death Stranding 2. No, stop before you say it, no, it's not like that. The first game, if you had showered, you would get certain rewards for doing it. And it's not like this game has taken away that aspect, but it certainly has lessened the reward factor. For showering, you only get chiral crystals, which would be neat if it weren't so easy to get them everywhere. They are lying around throughout Australia, and even if you can't find any, there are plenty of BTs around that are just waiting to be killed. Sure, maybe in the first couple of hours of the game they are hard to kill, but once you reach the 4 or 5 hour mark, they shouldn't be any problem at all. In Death Stranding, the reward you got for showering wasn't anything special, but I think it's neat that you could create grenades from simply using the shower or going to the bathroom. It wouldn't affect anything in a major way, but it was more or less a nice reward for taking a shower like the stinky little gremlin you are. The only reason this bothers me so much is due to the emphasis a lot of the characters put on not using the shower, talking about all kinds of negative effects. Of course, we never got to see those, as Sam would constantly shower whether you liked it or not. But here, when given the choice, it doesn't make a difference. The reward you get for it is so insignificant, it isn't worth it to begin with. I know it's nitpicky, but it's something that's been bugging me specifically, so I'm gonna talk about it. Adding on to the complaint of the claustrophobic nature of the DHV, but I think it is such a big missed opportunity to not make the entirety of the DHV interactable, instead of Sam only being confined to his own room. Not only would the game be able to hide more hidden character details and environment, but you could learn a lot more about the characters just by how they each uniquely design their own rooms. Not only would this be an improvement to the current situation, but would also build upon the foundation of the private rooms in the first game. For whatever reason, they didn't do this, and we are left to an extremely cramped and bland environment that you will surely slowly get sick of. Say what you want about the private rooms in the first game, but they actually felt like an interactive museum of sorts. Everywhere you looked, there was something for you to do, and the spaciousness of the environments made it feel like you had a lot more options and freedom. I'm aware that this is an extremely trivial thing to complain about, but if the game is going to constantly force me to spend my time in this room, then I expect something of value rather than more of the same, but worse. We are then introduced to two of the side characters that we will grow accustomed to throughout the game, Dollman and Hartman. I have problems with both of these characters, so I may as well split them up into sections. Although, you'll find that I have more to say about Dollman than Hartman, due to the fact that he is essentially a non-character, and there's not much I can say about him. As you may have gathered by now, Death Stranding 2 has a severe problem with developing their characters, where even Sam gets the short end of the stick in this case. Hartman is one of the best examples I can think of characters in this game getting little to no development, and I feel like he would have been better off as the antagonist for this game. That was a joke, George Miller, please don't sue me. All that is known about Hartman is that he is the pilot of the DHV Mellin, and he lost his son to the tar currents. That is essentially the gist of his character, other than the odd crumb of information where Hartman may get one line of development, but other than that, his characterization is very thin. As you already know by now, the only major piece of development that Hartman gets is the flashback he has where his son dies, but that important piece of info is entirely missable. To give the game some credit, Dollman makes it inherently obvious that it is important, but it is still missable nonetheless. And due to the fact that a lot of the dialogue in non-cutscenes is mostly just recapping what we already know, I wouldn't be surprised if someone missed what Dollman said about the book. Even if they didn't, we are only given one scene that lasts more than a minute devoted to Hartman's character. While it does explain why Hartman has a cat made of tar constantly nearby, there isn't enough exploration of his character, grief, or how he stands out from the other characters, other than his abilities. I think that his character had a lot of potential to work quite well, especially due to how he parallels to Sam. Both are parents who lost their child in some way that was out of their control, but they still have a manifestation of them that they hold near and dear. I think it would have been pretty neat to have a scene of Sam and Hartman talking about their grief, and both of them kind of relating to each other on the subject of losing a child. His character doesn't have to be the most fleshed out guy ever, but at least give me something. In fact, there's this one scene that Dollman and Sam share that could have set up a great character moment between the two, where Sam mentions Amelie. Other than that, there's not a whole lot I can talk about. There's seriously that little to him that I can only talk about him for a solid few paragraphs before completely blanking on what to say next. Dollman, on the other hand, is different, not because he's a good character or anything, but because he represents everything I despise about Death Stranding 2's storytelling, and a little bit of the first game too. In all honesty, Dollman is a character you are stuck with. He is not like the other characters who are stuck on the DHV Mellin, he is instead stuck to you, the player. The reason for this is simply that Fragile wants to maintain the illusion that Lou is still alive, or at least somewhat present within the pod, but other than that, he serves no other purpose. He is only there to be used as a plot device for Sam's grief, and is a non-character besides that. So what separates him from the rest of the undeveloped characters, I hear you asking? If he's everything wrong with Death Stranding storytelling, then surely there'd be a lot more to go off of than just that. And don't worry, there is. My main issue with Dollman is how much Dollman holds your hand in every single scene. In the first game, this was slightly annoying to a certain degree. At worst, you'd have someone like Die Hard Man or Fragile pop up every once in a while to say, "Sam, do you know about the oinkity boinkity?" Yes, I'm pretty aware of the oinkity boinkity. Oh, good. Here's how you use the oinkity boinkity. While it was slightly insulting to the player's intelligence, it didn't happen too much that it actively irritated me, but for Dollman, it irritated me to the degree of murderous intent. You could just come out of a 10-minute long cutscene where the characters intricately explain every detail of what you need to do, and Dollman will contribute in the only way he knows how, which is by dumbing down what they said in the 10-minute cutscene to make it more digestible for the person who is too busy watching TikTok to pay attention to the cutscene. Sometimes it won't even be for story-related purposes. He'll just point shit out for the love of the game. Yes, Dollman, I'm highly aware that there is a bandit camp nearby. I can actively see it. Yes, Dollman, I know that this weather sure does make things very hard to see. It's like this thing was built to rage bait me specifically to try and get me to quit the game. I've tried so hard to think of reasons as to why Dollman exists, other than to make Sam believe that Lou is still alive. Which I've already talked about why that plotline is stupid, so in reality, Dollman serves no purpose. What's the point in watching any of the cutscenes if Dollman is going to recap it anyway in 30 seconds or less? Instead of making him a recap machine, they could have gone ahead and made him do what he was originally designed to do, be a support thing for Sam, and offer him advice or methods to help him cope with his grief. It's frustrating because when Dollman has some good moments, albeit they are very rare ones, they are some of my favorite parts of the game. Like the line about grief that I mentioned earlier, that is a really good line, and had they made him into a character, they could have built off that small moment to create a dynamic that would have been enjoyable and satisfying to watch. Dollman doesn't have to be just quirky, he can be human as well. I think that's what a lot of people miss when writing these quirky comedic relief characters. They need to have something more going for them if they are going to have a larger presence within your story. Otherwise, there is nothing to grasp onto for the player. So instead of it being endearing, it starts to become more annoying than anything. Unfortunately, this evil demonic incantation of Ball doesn't end his reign here. He is also useful in gameplay. And by useful, I mean he is a one-trick pony, and his trick is copying something that already exists. For those of you who don't know, Dollman can be thrown up into the air as a way to scout the environment in case there may be something blocking your path, or if there are any enemies ahead that could pose a threat to you and your cargo. If you're asking why this description sounds a lot like the Watchtower, a structure that you can build within the game, then you'd be absolutely correct. Dollman is a direct copy of a Watchtower, but worse. There's no cooldown to Dollman, nor is there any cost to using him, which ultimately makes the Watchtower redundant, as there's no point in wasting materials on a PCC when you can simply have Dollman do the work for you. It honestly makes me question why you can even have Watchtowers as an option to build, as Dollman replaces them entirely. Yet somehow I don't think I've ever used Dollman in any of my 5 playthroughs, due to there just being no point to it. The game makes you so overpowered and encourages you to go in guns blazing that there is no point in scouting out your environment. And if I did want to scout out my environment, I would either use my compass mode or the aura deck that is already equipped to me. And out of all the people I've spoken to about this game, I don't think one of them has admitted to using Dollman more than maybe 3 times in their whole playthrough. But that's still not all, because he's also a semi-prominent figure in your room, and the purpose of this is for Dollman to once again parrot things that you already know without adding anything of substance to the conversation. I'm serious when I say that I have gone through every piece of dialogue that involves Dollman when you're in your room, and while a lot of it is still either recap or meaningless fluff, there's surprisingly more characterization here than anything you can find in gameplay, making it another Tarman situation, where on paper finding these little tidbits of character development would be neat if they were already developed beforehand. Ironically, despite all the hate I give him, with the amount of characterization he has, while very minuscule, he still manages to come on top as possibly one of the characters with the most depth in the game. He voices his opinions on events that occur throughout the game, unlike most of the other characters, and that's when he's at his most tolerable. He's even given a backstory, and like Tarman's, it is completely missable if you found his other conversations to be practically worthless. Another positive I'll give him is when he performs Horizon Dreamer to Sam. Hideo Kojima is possibly the only person who actively demonstrates how much they care about the people involved with his games, and the fact that he made a little hidden tribute towards one of the artists in the game is something so wholesome that you can't really find it in any other game. I wish other AAA games would do something similar, because by doing this, it not only shows your love and care towards the people who give their time to be in your game, but to the players as well. Bit of a tangent I went on there, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Unfortunately, other than the cool dance tribute, he is almost completely worthless. Maybe I would have been able to put up with him more if he, like any other side character, had any notable characteristics or qualities to him other than just being someone who repeats what everyone has already said. If he were in any other game, I wouldn't be complaining as much, but since almost every single part of this game has a negative to it, his presence makes things worse. After we take Dollman with us on our journey to connect Australia to the chiral network, we instantly encounter another issue. As we get into the elevator, we get hit with some flashbacks, just like what happened in the first game. The reason that this is made an issue is that it is made clear to us that Sam can only see visions through Lou when he connects to the pod. Problem is, Lou is dead, and that there is nothing in the pod that could possibly trigger a flashback. It can't be Dollman, because not only do we have no previously established connection to him, but he has no relationship with either Nirvana or Lou, so he couldn't possibly trigger the flashback. An explanation for how Sam can see these flashbacks is that Sam's dooms have increased since the first game, to the point where he can now see BTs on his own, meaning that he would be able to connect to both Neil and Tomorrow. However, I find this line of reasoning to be rather flimsy, as the first game has established that there needs to be some clear through line for Sam to be able to connect with these memories. For example, Cliff's connection with Sam is what allows him to experience these flashbacks. Not only that, but Cliff is mistaking the current BB that Sam has a connection to as his, which only adds more credence as to why he can see a lot of the flashbacks. However, with Neil there is no connection between the two. They are strangers to one another. The game tries to half-assedly cover this up by saying that there is the potential they've met before, but even then, if they had briefly encountered each other before in the past, it would need to leave a lasting impact on Sam for him to remember. And since Sam cannot remember any kind of event occurring, that rules that option out. The closest thing you can say they had to an interaction was the void out that Neil caused. But even then they didn't share any kind of connection, and it still feels kind of weak as a reason for Neil and Sam to be connected. Even if that were the case, it's pretty odd how all of this is happening now. This all happened back in America, and seeing how disconnected Neil Vana is from the main plot, the game has left me skeptical as to why none of this was ever explored or mentioned in the first game. It would not only fit a whole lot better, but it might have actually made some amount of sense. The fact that this is happening now only makes me question further as to why this game takes place in Australia if half the game's plot is connected back in America. The last explanation I could possibly think of as to why Sam can see Nirvana's flashbacks has to do with Sam's wife Lucy cheating on Sam with Neil, but for reasons I've stated previously, that also doesn't make a whole lot of sense, not to mention that plotline itself is just really contrived. We'll get into that later, but the fact that Sam and Neil had the same therapist that also happened to be his wife, and that his wife happened to have encountered him when they were kids, and he left her for dead, only for them both to somehow end up meeting each other again is simply laughable. I've spent hours trying to figure out how Sam seeing Neil's visions should even be possible, but I genuinely don't have an answer. The only thing I can give is speculation as to how it happened, because Kojima was so vague with giving us an answer to this, intentionally or otherwise. If someone does have an answer, then I'd like an explanation, because this makes no sense to me. Although even if someone did have a satisfying answer, it's still a problem that Kojima was so vague about it, considering this was such a big part of the game, and Kojima was not so subtle about telling you everything else when it related to Neil. This could have been an easy fix as well, since all you'd have to do is either retcon how Sam's connections to flashbacks work without previously contradicting the rules that had been established for them, or make the link to Neil more clear-cut. While Dollman says that in this specific scenario it is a little different, they never end up explaining why or how that is, so it's better to label this as an issue with the writing, rather than trying to spend any more time than I already have trying to decipher this story beat. Something that really bugs me though is the lack of Amelie in the narrative. While I would have been slightly annoyed if they hadn't have mentioned or showed her at all throughout the game, I'm even more annoyed by the fact they don't do anything with her. There are a lot of ways which Amelie can tie back into the narrative of the second game, especially when they use her beach as a battleground for Higgs and Sam, but they just don't do anything with it. It's such a weird thing to bring Higgs into the mix and not even have Amelie be a prominent figure, especially with how much of a part she had to play in the first game with not only manipulating Higgs, but getting him to do a lot of her dirty work. It honestly seems like the perfect combination. Instead, the lack of Amelie makes the narrative feel somewhat incomplete, I guess. I'm not even saying it's impossible to make a Death Stranding narrative without Amelie, but the way Kojima did it definitely didn't work. I'll substantiate my claims about Higgs a little later, but I think his presence was not as impactful as Kojima had hoped it would be. I think it's even weirder that hardly any of the characters ever bring up Amelie, seeing how she essentially manipulated everyone while she was running the UCA. If you're not going to bring back Amelie as a proper character, the best thing you could do is at least focus on the aftermath of how some of the characters are holding up from her actions. It doesn't even have to be the whole game as well. You could focus on it for possibly the first act, and then when we are reintroduced to Higgs, it would only add to the weight thematically. Not even Sam has a whole lot to say about her, which bothered me a lot. This is a guy who knew Amelie practically since birth, and you have nothing to say about any of the events that transpired previously. In a way, setting the narrative to take place 11 months later, after the first game, is kind of a convenient trick for Kojima to use, to not have to address anything that happened in the first game. The most we ever get is a couple of dream sequences involving her, and Sam very occasionally hallucinating her in the game. While I do find this to be pretty lazy and cheap, I think it could have worked from a thematic standpoint if Kojima didn't want her to be a big part of the narrative, and only wanted to use her for metaphorical purposes. Instead, all we get from this is a couple of vague dream sequences that last a minute, and a couple of moments where Amelie appears within the game. This isn't something that is spread throughout the game. A majority of these interactions only happen in the first act. Although she does appear very briefly at the end too, and it could have been a good emotional moment if it was more built up throughout the game. Again, you don't have to make her into a character if you don't want to. You can use her as some metaphorical figure instead, but at least give her something to make the random appearances of her character have more substance to them. Otherwise, you risk making your character feel more like a concept that was abandoned, instead of being explored to its fullest potential. The fact that she doesn't even talk to Sam once throughout the game gives me the sneaking suspicion that Lindsay Wagner was not able to come back and reprise her role for whatever reason that may have been. In fact, I noticed a slight trend with that when it comes to certain characters, like Lochner for example. If that is the case, then I understand why it would be hard to continue their stories without the actors involved. But in that case, it may be better to just do a recast instead of risking damage to the quality of your game. However, this could also be the case of the game being so cramped and having a maelstrom of different storylines that don't really have a cohesive through line to them that stop Kojima from giving her more focus in the narrative. Because you've got the APAS plot going on, Sam grieving his dead kid, the Nirvana flashbacks, and multiple combat encounters spread out through the game. Not to mention Higgs trying to fuck up everyone's day like last time, then there's figuring out the mystery of tomorrow, and then 5 other side stories that aren't as important to the plot, but are still given minimal amounts of screen time. It's no wonder there wasn't a place for Amelie within the confines of the narrative. What's even more ironic is that this game is actually a lot shorter than the first, which I find quite funny. You've got all these plotlines going on in the game, and you think that it's a good idea to make the game shorter? What's even more amusing is before the game came out, I saw this one article mentioning how one of the reviewers had played for 80 hours, and they still weren't done with the game, which was either a lie or they were trying to do a completionist run of the game, because out of all of my 5 playthroughs for Death Stranding 2, only 2 of them went over the 30-hour mark. The first was a bit over 90 hours, and before any of you say anything, this was a completionist run. The amount of time it took me to complete the story was only a mere 32.5 hours. This was from not only streaming the game, which means I would have been fucking around a lot more than I would have on a regular playthrough, but I also never used any of the fast travel, and spent half the game traveling on foot to give me a better challenge, along with the fact that I spent half the game playing on the hardest difficulty without realizing. You'd think with all these variables, my playthrough would have been a lot longer, but it turns out when looking up the stats for the average playthrough on how long to beat, my time was still below the average, with most players clocking in a 34.5 hour time. Meanwhile, my time for Death Stranding 1 was 10 hours longer. Now, I don't want to give the impression that I think that shorter games are bad. In fact, many of my favorite games are extremely short in terms of length. I prefer quality in the length of my games, not quantity. But for what Death Stranding 2 is trying to tackle in terms of story and gameplay, it either needs to be a lot longer or some of the material needs to be cut, because the length of the story and gameplay do not mesh well with this amount of time. Since we are on the subject of Amelie, I suppose we should talk about the two main antagonists of the game, the President and Higgs. Of course, we'll talk about them both individually, but my thoughts on them as villains is that they are incredibly surface level, as not only characters, but antagonists too. Higgs is essentially brought back from the dead, and goes back to doing what he had set out to do in the first game. He wants to cause the last stranding, and because Fragile had left him on the beach, he now wants revenge for what Fragile did to him, and to basically just make them suffer. Except now it's just even less engaging than it was the first time they did it. I've already briefly touched upon why I think that Amelie not being involved whatsoever with Higgs is quite a big missed opportunity, but it's quite clear without Amelie, Higgs feels extremely one-dimensional. I don't necessarily have a problem with Higgs's motive being revenge, but his goals are hardly ever explored, other than what he wants to do from a surface level perspective. It's hard to ever get invested in him, because other than his final scene, his character is extremely lacking. In almost every scene you encounter him, he says the exact same thing, about how he wants us to suffer, or that he's gonna kill everyone that we love, and after the third time I heard that shit, it just got on my nerves. It's not helped by the fact that it is established that he can go basically wherever he wants at any time of his choosing, which makes it feel quite underwhelming, as he is not even using that to his advantage. You encounter Higgs maybe once every 3 or 4 hours, and even that's being generous. So this whole "I want to kill you and everyone you love" spiel doesn't feel very convincing, as once you encounter him, he leaves you alone for a few hours before coming back again. If you're committing to the story thread of Higgs being back, and you've established to us that Higgs can essentially go anywhere at any time, then you have to make him a constant, overwhelming presence throughout the game, and not someone who occasionally shows up every now and again. If Higgs does want Sam to truly suffer, why doesn't he just kill everyone on board the DHV Mellin or pick them off one by one? He was around before Tomorrow even got introduced into the story, so I'm not quite sure what is stopping him. At times I feel like his motives are a little inconsistent with one another, since later in the story, when he manages to invade the DHV, he says he won't kill anyone who gets off, but I thought that the whole point of this was to make Sam suffer. Why are you willing to let him go? I know that would mean that they've abandoned Sam, but I feel like Sam would rather they save themselves than die with him. What's a real head scratcher for me though is the explanation for Higgs's return, because no matter how much I try to make sense of it, nothing adds up. To put it simply, the reason why Higgs was able to return was because of the APAC voidout that stranded 4,000 people. As Higgs's soul wandered the beach, the consciousness of APAS 4000 decided to pull him into the network. I have many questions in regards to not just about Higgs being brought back, but by the existence of APAS 4000 in general. In Death Stranding 1, it is established to the audience that unless you are in between life and death, your soul wanders off into the seam of the ocean and crosses over. The reason I bring this up is because I'm confused why this didn't happen to all 4,000 people who lost their lives in the voidout. Does this happen every time when a voidout happens with this many people? Then there's APAC's plan, which can only work if the souls agree with them. And the plan is to basically erase all of humanity so it can be replaced by a better species. This was a plot point in the first game that Amelie was heavily against. The beach to her was something of a lonely and meaningless existence, where she was trapped outside of life and death. The entire reason she wants to trigger the last stranding to begin with is because she sees this limbo zone as worse than extinction. But when APAS or APAC want to preserve human souls by uploading them to an artificial beach, which in turn will protect them from extinction, this gets all 4,000 souls sold on this plan. How? Well, we know from what has been established by Amelie in the first game that the place is terrible to live in, so the fact that he's able to sell everyone on this idea is ridiculous. I think what stops me from fully getting invested in Higgs in the sequel, other than the extremely thin motivations, is that the first game not only did this plot, but they did it so much better. At the end of the game, everything had been so neatly tied up with Higgs. While there were certain things they could have done a bit better with his character in the first game, I was still incredibly satisfied with how they ended his character in the first game. So when he comes back with the same motivations, only to have now succeeded in killing Fragile, I'm not entirely sure what the point of it all is. I need something more to latch onto, and unfortunately Higgs's character didn't give me what I wanted for his return to be justified in any way, leading me to APAST and with the President. There's not a whole lot to say about the President. He's mostly there to pop up every so often and congratulate me for hooking up facilities to the chiral network. Other than that, he's not the most present guy for an antagonist. It's not until the final few hours of the game does he actually get given something to do, and that's only when Fragile finds out that APAS was behind the manufacturing of these mechs. So the parts where he is in the game is mostly him just trying to say, no, Sam, I'm definitely not the bad guy. It's your friends that you've known for 2 games now. Trust me, Sam, I'm not evil. This happens every hour or so in the game, and it really doesn't help with who the surprise twist villain is. Considering Kojima's track record when it comes to espionage narratives covering government corruption, it's not all that surprising when the President turns out to be evil. I mean, come on, he turns red when speaking to Sam privately. Also, I'm not quite sure how I feel about Sam not telling anyone about the information that he has received about Bridges when talking to the President. I feel like he'd at least inform Fragile about this information, considering that he's known her for almost a year now. But then again, there's nothing in the second game that would contradict Sam's character if he doesn't tell anyone, but that's because he essentially has no agency nor a character to begin with. Even if you're telling me that Sam somehow doesn't tell anyone about this, Dollman definitely would. Dollman owes his life to Fragile for saving him from being stuck in the mud next to his dead daughter for his whole life. So if Sam doesn't have any kind of moral obligation to tell Fragile, Dollman definitely does. In fact, it's kind of funny how these conversations are labeled private conversations in the first place, considering how Dollman is able to listen in the whole time. Something I'm a little unsure of would have to be the final confrontation between the President, Sam, and Die Hard Man. This is a sequence that has been stuck in my head ever since I finished the game, and after a lot of thinking, I've come to the conclusion that I like the idea of this scene more so than the execution itself. On paper, this seems like a scene I would praise. A moment of confrontation where Die Hard Man defeats the antagonist of the game by doing something so unpredictable that not even an AI could possibly comprehend nor understand it. It's such a human thing to do in face of an AI trying to take over the world. Conceptually, I appreciate the idea of how short the confrontation is as well. For the sake of drama, stories will often draw out fights between the central protagonist and the villain of the game for nothing more than to generate hype for the audience. So the fact that the fight between the President and Die Hardman is so short is something that I like. Although, knowing Kojima, I was half expecting Die Hardman and the President to have an actually face off for a good few minutes. Instead, it's all pretty quick, which is also kind of my problem. There are some things that are explained about the President, but I still have certain questions about his plan that I mentioned earlier that were simply never mentioned nor elaborated on. I think the main reason I don't like how quick it all goes by is because of this being the first time we ever hear of the APAS 4000 or the President's plan, so the second it was introduced, it was immediately thrown away the next second, and I would have appreciated it if they had fleshed some things out. Whether my opinion on this section of the story has been impacted by the lack of character and plot development for the rest of the game, I'm not quite sure. Maybe if the game's story and characters were more tighter as a whole, I would appreciate this part of the game a lot more. But I think that this twist could have been done a lot better, especially with the APAS 4000 ordeal not making a whole lot of sense to me. Again, I like the commentary and messaging that comes from this portion of the game, that humanity needs to make its own decisions, and that we need to be free and live our lives, instead of letting AI run things. Not to say that AI is completely terrible, because that's not what the game is trying to say at all. If used properly, AI can be a great tool, but the issue that the game brings up is that this is a very dangerous tool, and if used improperly, or for means outside of the nature it was intended to be used for, it can be awful. Unfortunately, this issue of AI versus humanity is only put to the forefront at the very end of the game for a few minutes. Personally, I would have liked to see this as more of a present problem for the characters to deal with throughout the story, rather than only addressing it at the end of the game. This change was most likely the one that Kojima made some last-minute changes to when it came to the script, due to the fact that the critics liked his game too much, but it's a little hard to tell when almost every story element is underbaked. It also becomes a little unsatisfying when the new plate gate is built up for a majority of the game, only for it to be something that we never get to use by the end. This could be explained as Kojima saving the plate gate as something to be used in a future installment of Death Stranding, but even then, it would have been nice to have something. I would have even been content with a cutscene for all my troubles, but instead I'm left a little bitter about it all. Nirvana is one of the most beloved characters in Death Stranding 2, and serves a big purpose in the story of Death Stranding 2. However, like any character in the game, I've got my issues with him. Interestingly, my issues with his character are not just story related, but gameplay as well, which means that I'm going to have to split my critique of his character into two parts. The first part I'll be covering now, and the second part I'll cover a little later when I cover the gameplay of Death Stranding. A quick criticism that I'll get out of the way, as it is something that I bring up for every character, is that Nirvana, like everyone else, is not developed well enough for me to care about him at all. And that's mostly because he is tied to a story that is not only unnecessary, but makes the first game worse in retrospect. The first two times you encounter Nirvana, the environment is pretty important towards future events that occur within the story. The war-torn environment in the first encounter is tied to when he meets Lucy and abandons her. The second is in a hospital, which connects to Void Out. Obviously, this entire plotline is a carbon copy of Cliff's storyline from Death Stranding 1. You are taken into an environment against your will, the character you're facing off against is connected to Sam in some way, and you have to fight him on numerous occasions. I could go on, and while it is clear that it's supposed to mirror Cliff's story, it comes across more as copying than anything else, as the entire game is a repeat of the first. In both cases, both Cliff and Nirvana don't recognize you at first until much later. For Cliff, I can understand, since he thinks you are trying to take his child away from him, and doesn't recognize the older version of Sam. In Nirvana case, I have no earthly clue as to why Nirvana didn't recognize him sooner. In fact, it only makes him seem like an idiot more than anything in retrospect. There's not even an explanation for why he doesn't, he just doesn't recognize you until later. And when I say this, I don't mean that Nirvana has to recognize him immediately, but once you get to the second segment, that's when I get pretty iffy about it. It's eventually revealed to us the importance of these flashbacks, and that's that Lucy, Sam's wife, was the one who Nirvana tried saving back in Mexico, but abandoned her in the process. Not only that, but when they reunite again, they start some kind of relationship together, and Lucy gets pregnant with Sam's daughter. Right off the bat, I have many issues with this. The first is the sheer amount of contrivance and suspension of disbelief you need to have in order to buy that after abandoning her in Mexico, they somehow managed to meet up again years later. Not only is it very unlikely, but it's even more unlikely due to how many people have been killed over the years from BTs and Timefall. So already, we are not off to a great start. Then there's the entire affair plot point, which is a can of worms on its own, but I find it hard to believe that the girl who got abandoned by some kid when she was a child would willingly hook up with him after all those years of hate and resentment. But the worst part about it has to be how little the game itself actually touches upon the fact that Lucy cheated on Sam and puts her on the hook for it. Sam barely talks about the entire cheating situation, and Neil doesn't touch upon it either. Both are clearly hurt by it, but not for long. Sam is upset about it for a few minutes in the game, and then he moves on just like that. Obviously, it doesn't take a genius to point out that cheating is wrong, but it's the fact that the game hardly touches upon how hurt Sam and Nirvana were by her actions for more than 5 minutes. This should be something that is brought up more than once throughout the game, but once it is revealed, Sam never really has to confront it again. There's no challenge or obstacle that he has to overcome in his arc to get over Lucy. When he is told the news, he gets upset for a couple minutes and then moves on. Similarly, I don't like how the relationship between Nirvana and Lucy was handled, as I would have preferred if it was a lot more prominent throughout the story, rather than just a 10-minute cutscene. I would much rather slowly learning about Lucy and Nirvana as characters throughout the course of the game, and by the end, we could get the whole picture as to how their relationship evolved throughout the game. Instead, the game is more insistent that it give you a summary of these events, rather than retroactively trying to enhance the characters in any meaningful way. Not everything in life is black and white. There are always motivations and influences behind what you do, and I think us learning about Lucy and Nirvana's characters could have made me empathize with their situations a lot more. The game is fine with making Lucy seem like the villain in the story without us having a clear picture as to why she did what she did. Even when they do make her the villain, they seem to let her off the hook relatively quickly, so it almost feels like her cheating on Sam and betraying Neil had no consequence whatsoever. Then there's how Lucy died, which I find kind of weird, because we are told how she dies in the first game, and it doesn't line up with the events of what happened at all. Like, it's not even close. In the first game, it is told through the game's interviews that Lucy died via drug overdose. Whether it was intentional or not is a mystery to Bridges, but it's pretty implied that she meant to kill herself. The second game actively contradicts this by showing us that Lucy dies from multiple gunshot wounds, so it's very apparent to me that this plotline was not planned from the start, and that Kojima wanted an excuse to have Sam and Lou be biologically related because he most likely became attached to Sam through his writing process. Unfortunately, this will not be the last time the game actively contradicts something from the character interviews in the first game, as it seems clear to me that this game is willing to contradict anything from the game's first story, if that means creating a narrative that only Kojima is satisfied with. As someone who adored the first game, I enjoyed reading up on the interviews, as they were, in a way, the cherry on top for completing the game. If you liked the characters, well, now you can learn little bits of information about them by completing extra orders in post-game completion. Kojima's seemingly lack of care or disregard for these interviews says a lot. As someone who spent time unlocking them, it makes me wonder why he even made them to begin with, if they were just going to get retconned in the second game. It not only tells me that he didn't care enough about the narrative he so delicately crafted in the first game to even take the time out of his day and make sure he's getting the most basic things right. This entire thing deterred me from reading anything character related from the corpus in the second game, because what's the point? If you're going to contradict information that you've told us in the first game, then why should I waste my time reading anything from there if it's just going to get contradicted further in a future installment? This is where my experience as the player comes in, because I'm not sure a whole lot of players have bothered to read every single interview, mail, or memory chip, so you might not see what the big deal about my complaints are, but to me it just shows a lack of care on Kojima's part, as someone who did like reading up on those things. Speaking of which, I think we should talk about the giant elephant in the room, that being the revelation that Lou is actually Lucy's baby. A lot of people seem to like this retcon in the story, and in a way, I can understand why many players like this change, but I cannot describe how much I despise it. My main reason has to do with how much it kinda ruins their first interactions within the game. By making Lou and Sam related, it makes their first meeting all the more contrived, as Sam is given the BB under happenstance. The game very clearly points out to you that this is meant to be nothing more than some random BB that you connect with over time in the lonely and cruel world of Death Stranding. But now, after the reveal, it leaves me with more questions than answers. I don't know about you, but I prefer the message of found family in the first game, that no matter how lost or alone you are, you can find family in the most unlikely of individuals. And that even if you're going through your darkest hour, you will always find people to connect with and bond over everywhere. However, that revelation kind of ruins that messaging, as they want to contradict information from the first game in order to give us a twist that we didn't see coming. Even the gameplay sections don't give you a whole lot of information about Neil as a person. Instead, the sections concern itself with setting up mystery boxes for the plot to unravel, rather than giving Neil a character for us to explore. I may even go so far as to say that Nirvana is completely worthless as a character. What changes after learning that Lou is our daughter? Well, nothing really. Sam doesn't seem to give much of a shit, and their relationship doesn't change as they already consider themselves to be father and daughter anyway. This revelation about Lucy doesn't seem to change too much either, as Sam confronts those feelings about her for like 3 seconds before moving on completely. The problem I have with this revelation is that there's not enough of a reaction from any of the characters, and things hardly change at all for any of Nirvana's screen time to be justified. The man is essentially a plot device who is there to be essentially another Cliff to avoid having to work on creating a more original plotline. The most disappointing thing is that Nirvana could have worked if they had tried to make him more of a character instead of some plot device with no agency at all within the story. Speaking of plot devices, through our first confrontation with Nirvana, we get introduced to the character of Tomorrow. Tomorrow is a mystery. In fact, she's such a mystery, it's almost all any of the characters ever talk about when she's brought up. The game seems to focus too much on the mystery element of her character, as they seemingly manage to forget to give her a character in the process. I know I've said this for every character thus far, but I'd say that out of all the characters that don't get any sort of development in the game, Tomorrow's lack of development is arguably the most offensive. It's revealed pretty late in the game that Tomorrow is actually just a matured version of Lou. Her character consists of being Sam's daughter and hating shoes. I'm glad Kojima finally has an excuse to scan some celebrities' feet. I was worried he had lost his touch there for a moment. I wish I was joking when I say that's basically her whole character. Oddly, for a character who is meant to be Sam's daughter, you know, Sam's entire reason for living, she seemingly gets little to no interactions with Sam. There are at least a couple of scenes where she had the potential for some great character growth, like the scene where she runs off. Granted, the setup for it is a bit shaky, as we have gotten no previously established characterization for Tomorrow, other than the fact that she doesn't like it here, and the fact that Tomorrow even managing to leave for an extended period of time is kind of insane to me. We were just in a cutscene that Tomorrow was also in, and when it ended, Sam went back to his room, but suddenly Tomorrow has magically disappeared. Now, when I say disappeared, I don't mean that she didn't just leave the DHV, but that she's miles away from it. You could excuse this by saying that she used her tar to move around more quickly, but when you scan the environment, it clearly shows that she ran off. The timeline of events is not adding up, and it only makes me think this was an excuse for Kojima to get us to chase some footprints to pad out the game longer. I'm also not quite sure how everyone on the DHV didn't find out about Tomorrow's identity sooner, considering how obvious Lou's birthmark is. It's not even like you could defend it by saying they just so happened to miss it. They were doing a full body examination on her the second she showed up, so it would have been nigh impossible to miss. So I see two explanations as for how they didn't. They either did actually know about it, but for some reason didn't tell Sam, despite the fact that it would have cured his grief, or the DHV crew are a bunch of incompetent idiots. Pick your poison. Despite my complaints with the setup, I do believe this could have worked as the basis for a good character moment, where Tomorrow finally accepts the DHV as her home, and Sam and the crew as family. The game attempts to do this by putting Sam in danger, which would prompt Tomorrow to save Sam, and afterwards she is brought back to the DHV. But like everything else in this game, it is sorely underbaked. Not only does it need the proper setup with Tomorrow to make her coming back to the DHV feel like a satisfying character moment, but I need more with these characters in this scene. It is so close to being a great scene, where two characters who have seemingly lost everything become vulnerable with each other for the first time. Instead, Tomorrow is mainly used to fight off against Higgs whenever he appears, so she can save Sam. Not that I have a problem with that specifically, but I do wish they were more consistent with it. Throughout the game, Tomorrow manages to kick Higgs' ass with ease every time they face off against each other, but then at the end of the game, she is almost instantly annihilated by him. This is the only reason that Higgs can start the last Stranding to wipe out humanity, by the way, and instead of him having to use his intelligence to either lure her into a trap, or something that would require him to use his brain, he instead manages to take her down with ease. There's something that irks me about your most powerful female character being reduced to a background character for Sam and Higgs to fight over without it being earned. While I would have been fine with this if they had made it so it was Sam's own socially awkward attempt at being vulnerable, but as the game progresses further, they open up more and more with each other. But they don't do that. Sadly, there are a lot of scenes like this one, where on paper they would be incredible character-defining scenes, but the moments are not built up enough to be anywhere near as satisfying as they want them to be. The scene after Higgs tortures Sam and Rainey, Fragile, and Tomorrow all come to comfort Sam is on paper a beautiful scene that would guarantee sobbing from every player who had gone to that point. Unfortunately, we hardly know anything about Tomorrow. Rainey's character is summarized in a 2-minute flashback, And Fragile is a character who only exists to spout exposition about the plot to Sam. So when I reached this scene on my first playthrough, instead of being absolutely floored whilst sobbing like a baby for minutes on end, I just felt nothing and thought to myself, man, if I actually cared about these characters, then this scene would be amazing. And I'm not bringing this up as a way to shit on the game, it's just that the most frustrating thing about it is that it has little moments like these, and I know that if they put some more development into the characters, these moments could have surpassed the first game's story. But they waste these moments, because they are more interested in telling us the story of Nirvana, the ore farmer who isn't even that good of a character either. Cliff is clearly the better ore farmer. The game gets so wrapped up in telling its convoluted narrative that it forgets that it needs good characters for it to work. Your story could be the best story on Earth, and I mean the best. Not saying that Death Stranding 2 is, even if it did have great characters, but I'm just using this as an example. It could have everything that makes a plot perfect, but if you don't have characters that I care about, or are well developed in the slightest, then what's the point? Rainey is another example of the character that only exists in order to be a plot device for the story. In all honesty, I could probably round up all the characters who fall under the only exist to be a plot device category, and all the things that I'd say would be applicable to every character within that category. They are essentially the Isha of Death Stranding 2. For those of you who don't know what an Isha character is, then I should warn you about spoilers for Season 2 of Arcane, because I'll be briefly spoiling a couple of plot elements from that season. Not that it matters anyway, that season is utter garbage. But basically, Isha is a character who only exists as an excuse for Jinx to not have an overarching arc, in regards to her feeling bad for killing what was essentially a father figure to her. We never know anything about Isha, her characterization is extremely thin, and it's clear that she only exists to look and act cute so that the audience can go, "Aww, isn't she adorable?" This is reinforced even more so by the fact that she literally cannot speak, which gives the writers an easy way out for them to not have to write dialogue for her. This is what I mean when I say that she exists in the first half of the season to be a sort of cure-all for Jinx's issues, without needing to show the journey of how she gets there. Then in the second half, she sacrifices herself and dies, which is only done so Jinx can be depressed for 2 episodes, before having her depression basically cured in record time. Isha is possibly the best example I can give of a character whose existence is only validated so she can move the plot forwards without having any agency or character herself. Isha is given no backstory, no character, and yet changes so much of the story around her that it is simply quite insane to me. So when I say that all these characters are basically Isha characters, that's what I mean. Rainey's character development is extremely minimal. You meet her quite early on in the game, but surprisingly her depth in character is quite shallow. You get shown a cutscene of her backstory, and how she came to be a part of the group, which only gives me more questions than answers. Because of how the game rushes through the story, it makes me very confused about the timeline of events. Did these things happen to Rainey within the span of a week? A month? A year? If she's shown about to commit suicide, then I guess she tried to keep going as long as she could for the baby, so I'm going to be generous and say maybe a month? The reason this is an issue for me is the fact that I'm assuming that Fragile hadn't heard anything about Rainey until recently, otherwise she would have saved her sooner. But if we're going off of the basis that there has been a person with rain powers wandering around the country, surely word would have spread about that fast, right? Meaning that Fragile should have been there to help Rainey a lot sooner. The point that I'm trying to get across is that it feels quite convenient that Fragile manages to find Rainey at the last second, right before she's about to off herself. I understand what they're going for, but since they rush through Rainey's story so quickly, there's no development that makes any of the events that have occurred that led to the payoff be even remotely satisfying. I understand what the narrative through line is, but I need something more for it to be even remotely emotionally impactful. And again, like I've said for almost every other character, I wouldn't have minded that her backstory is this short if they had bothered to develop her character any further in the story. The only thing that is half important about her is that she's pregnant, but can't give birth, and if they tried doing a C-section on her, then she would die. This is a concept that would have been interesting to learn about while progressing through the narrative, but it is wasted because, you guessed it, they don't develop it a whole lot. I know that Rainey is sad about this, but maybe if we had had a scene where she talked about her emotions or went through her feelings in regards to giving birth in a world like Death Stranding, then maybe I would have given this plotline the time of day. But then we see the magical doctor lady about it, and it's all resolved, just like that. It doesn't feel like there is any emotional weight behind it, just that they are trying to wrap this particular plotline up as quickly as possible so they can make way for the other 10 plotlines that need wrapping up in the process. The game keeps jumping from one crisis to the other, which left me grasping for a moment of peace that never happened. Just one moment to breathe, that's all I need. This sorely contrasts with the first game's pacing, especially in the Mama storyline, who was also weirdly absent in this game, where the game allowed you space to reflect in the melancholy of her story. The section where you had to deliver Mama's body to Lochner was slow and contemplative for a reason. A big emotional moment is occurring, and while they could interrupt it with numerous different obstacles that require the player to engage in 100 different bosses, the game instead engages the player with silence. While that silence is occasionally broken up by Mama talking about her experiences growing up with Lochner, the interruptions never feel inappropriate, they're almost necessary. With the exception of the gonk-ass boss that you have to fight at the very beginning of the mission before progressing. But even with the addition of the boss, it doesn't change the point I'm making here. Mama talks about her experiences as if she's been waiting her whole life to tell somebody about what she has gone through, and ironically, out in the open where there is no one but Sam to hear, it's so intimate and you can feel the emotion in her story. We never get that in Death Stranding 2. Every character constantly needs you to be on your feet, and these methodical moments from the first game are lost. Shockingly, despite how much time Hartman got in the first game, he's practically sidelined in the second game to be another expositional plot machine that Sam only goes to when convenient. Of course, Sam only visited him when he needed to in the first game as well, but they at least gave him some sort of arc or character within the game. While it wasn't great, as the closure to his story was left in the backlogs of the interview section, where basically no one will see it, the exploration that we did get of his character was interesting nonetheless. When I first played Death Stranding 1, I had hoped that if they were ever going to do a sequel, they would give Hartman some more focus than the first game did, and I can say that I am sorely disappointed with what they've done to him. Not only have they sidelined him even further than what they did in the first game, but they also character assassinated him for reasons I don't know why. I mentioned before that his arc was wrapped up in an interview section of the game, and I figured that was done due to a lack of time and budget. Basically, the interview stated that he had given up on searching for his family, as he realized that it would change nothing whether he found them or not. He needed to move on with his life, as he didn't want grief taking a hold of him anymore. For some reason, they contradict that in the sequel, where they state that Hartman is looking for his family 11 months later. He justifies this by saying,
"Still looking for him, huh?"
I am. They're a large part of the reason I came to this place.
But it's never elaborated on what is so important that made him come running to Australia. But I guess that's not important. So not only do they character assassinate Hartman, they say that part of the reason that he's here is that there is something in Australia that will help him with his quest to finding his family. That is never elaborated on. They could have easily fixed this by actually elaborating on why Hartman is here. Maybe the reason he's here is that APAS has convinced him that he'd have a better chance of finding his family here for reasons that are unknown to us. Hilariously, this plotline that revolves around his family goes nowhere. In the first game, I always found the game's commentary on Hartman to be kind of depressing in a way, that he is constantly obsessing over a goal that will never come to fruition. The game even has potentially a false accounting from Hartman's part, where he saw them go towards the Strand, meaning that he'd never be able to locate them again. But Hartman is almost certain that they can still be found, despite that most likely not being the case from what we've been told. While it could be a clear contradiction, I don't think it is, as we've seen how obsessive and deluded Hartman is, and that final message from him is meant to be the sad resignation of his character, realizing that he will never find his family, and that he was only deluding himself. In this game, they don't really do anything with Hartman's family. It's never actually resolved, even though it would be fairly easy to resolve it. Although even if they did resolve it, I'm sure I'd have a problem with it. because if they made it so Hartman gives up his search, then I'd say they are literally just repeating what they did in Death Stranding 1, and if they brought them back, then I would say it goes against his entire arc. No matter how you spin it, it's a lose-lose situation. There's no way you can resolve that arc because it has already been resolved. They could have just as easily brought him back to help Sam in Australia, because Sam had helped him out in the past. He doesn't need a bigger reason other than that. Why does Kojima think that the only way that Hartman can come to Australia is if they bring back an already resolved plotline? In a way, I think Kojima realized that there was no way to make Hartman's conflict come to a conclusion that would be either coherent or satisfying, so he opted out for the next best approach, giving him another conflict to work through, so hopefully you forget about his main one. This conflict is barely even a conflict in my eyes, but the game treats it so seriously, even though the result is a whole bunch of meaningless fluff. Basically, Hartman and other individuals like Fragile have been getting sent emails by Hartman, despite Hartman having no recollection of ever writing them. On a first playthrough, this is something that I thought was going to be super important to the plot, but as time went by, the game never mentioned it again, so I forgot about it. Then they decide to bring it up again near the end of the game, where Fragile randomly calls in and asks Sam if he has seen Hartman acting weird as of late. I found this to be quite funny, as Hartman is one of the characters that I had hardly seen at all throughout Death Stranding 2, so the question felt extremely jarring and out of place. Turns out that this was set up so it could be revealed later on that Deadman has taken over Hartman's body for reasons. I have many thoughts on this, but the main question I have is just why? Why is this happening? What bearing does this have, if any, on the plot for Deadman to have taken over Hartman's body? What is this contributing? To answer that question for you, nothing. This revelation changes nothing within the world of Death Stranding. This changes nothing between the dynamic of the characters, and it changes nothing for the plot. They just decide to add this in as a little twist, as an attempt to make the story more interesting. The fact that no one knew about this as well is a little concerning to me. I feel like it's a bit out of character for Deadman to take over Hartman's body and just straight up not inform anyone of this. It's not like him being there is a bad thing or isn't allowed. He straight up didn't tell anyone because the dude didn't feel like it. I don't think I need to spell out the safety concerns and just things in general as to why Deadman not telling anyone is a bad idea. In the first game, he's even characterized as someone who is quite by the book. That is until he finds out what is really going on and attempts to communicate with Sam in secret. But he has no reason not to trust anyone aboard the DHV, as half the people there are people he already knows. Not only that, but this reveal kind of undermines his death at the beginning of the game, as the game has stated no purpose for bringing him back. It's not like he was needed for anything in particular, this game just felt like bringing him back because why not? It also takes away from Hartman's character, because he has already hardly been characterized at all throughout the game. So when it is revealed that Deadman is back in the form of Hartman's body, that is of course going to detract attention from him as a whole. Not to say that he even had a character arc to begin with in this game, but still, it feels like they're using him as a vessel just so Kojima can bring back one of his favorite OCs. Adding on to the pile of complaints for undeveloped characters is how the game insists on holding all the cards for its characters until the end of the game. I've complained enough about the lack of development for the characters already, but I can't help how that adds to the feeling when they all leave out all the important character moments until the end. Of course, this would change nothing in terms of how rushed and underbaked these character arcs are, but it would have helped with the pacing immensely. Before we move on to the gameplay, there are a couple things I'd like to mention that weren't long enough to talk about, so I'll just quickly list them off here. The motherhood is something I would have liked to see more of throughout the game. These characters are only introduced because the characters need them, but it would have been neat to see them expanded upon further, rather than getting the bare minimum for world building. This is an issue I've had since the first game, but since the game never bothered to fix them, it is now an even bigger issue for me, that being the shelter conversations. All of them go on for a lot longer than they need to, and most of the time they only serve as fluff. Whenever you give them an item, they talk for way too long about how thankful they are, and how this will be very helpful for the people living in the shelters. It's tolerable for the first few times you hear it, but after the 10th time you hook up a facility to the chiral network, or deliver a package to them, it gets mildly irritating. Voice acting is the final thing I'd like to touch on, and that's that it is quite apparent to me that Kojima is more concerned with hiring recognizable celebrities than talent. Not to say that putting celebrities in your game is a bad thing, but it's clear to me that while some of them are great actors, they are not great voice actors. This doesn't always mean that the character is at fault for this, as it could be a directing issue as well, but I highly doubt it. This is mainly a comment on Tomorrow and Rainey's performances. Both of them feel quite stilted and unnatural for me at points, and I'm aware that it's hard to judge acting from a critical format, since it's difficult to prove what is good acting and what isn't, as a lot of it comes from what you respond to emotionally. But from my experience after having played the game 5 times now, is that Tomorrow and Rainey's performances didn't quite do it for me. That being said, all the returning characters' performances are a lot better in comparison to how they acted in the first game. It's quite clear that not a whole lot of them were used to doing mocap, and now after a whole game of doing it, their performances definitely seem more natural and believable to me. At the beginning of my video, I briefly touched on safe sequels, and used Portal 2 as an example. However, I want to go a little more in depth with this comparison, since there's an element in both games that Portal 2 succeeds at perfectly and Death Stranding 2 fails at miserably, that being the concept of progression in gameplay. In Death Stranding 2, you are given multiple weapons as rewards for delivering packages and hooking up facilities to the chiral network. The issue that I have with this is that the game likes to give you a lot of weapons and other equipment that you either don't end up using or you become too overwhelmed to use them because of how frequently you are given new equipment. Every time I was given a weapon or some other piece of equipment to use, it would only take a mission or two before I'd immediately receive a new weapon or piece of equipment. This would happen so much that I ended up hardly using any of the weapons at all in my first playthrough. Actually, let's have a pop quiz. Can you guess how many weapons and or equipment you get from doing only the main story missions within the game? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? Well, it's 35. From my time playing the game, I counted 35 items I got from only doing mainline missions. That is obscenely high. There are 48 main missions in the game, which means you have a 72% chance of receiving a new weapon every time you complete an order. By now you may be wondering what Portal has to do with this. Portal is a puzzle game, not a shooter after all. Well, despite how much they differ in gameplay, the progression system is quite comparable to Death Stranding 2's gameplay progression. In Portal 1, the progression is relatively simple. Complete X amount of puzzles and you get a new gameplay component that changes the status quo a little bit. At the beginning of the game, you go 3 puzzles without even getting the portal gun, as a way of testing your abilities for the basic gameplay mechanics. Once the game thinks you are familiar enough with the gameplay loop, is only when it decides to give you the portal gun, except you only get half of its abilities. You can only make 1 portal instead of 2. By now you can see how the gameplay loop works, as the game slowly wants to build up your competency and knowledge so you can be entrusted with more gameplay mechanics. It's a simple yet effective way of getting the player familiar with your core mechanics so they can complete your challenges without struggling more than they need to. Portal 2 does practically the same thing, except it has the difficult challenge of trying not to make the experience feel repetitive, all while not straying too far away from its core mechanics. So instead of changing anything about the portal gun, they decide to change the environment and design some new mechanics for the player. But they introduced those mechanics in a very similar vein to the first game, where they would ensure that the player is familiar with the mechanics before moving on to the next one, thus making the experience more challenging and less frustrating, all while staying true to Portal's core identity. Which is where the problem lies with Death Stranding 2. With Portal, the game ensured that you had enough time with the mechanics it introduced before throwing new ones at you, whereas Death Stranding 2 wants to introduce as many mechanics as possible without putting in the effort of developing them. To put it simply, the combat system for the game is messy. Like many things in this game, it is a half-baked maelstrom of ideas that don't focus on one area of the combat, so instead it feels like they are shotgunning ideas until something sticks. On your first mission, you come across an enemy camp, and it is told that you're meant to try and stealth your way through this section. This idea on paper is interesting, as it gave me the impression that there were many alternatives to how you could play the game, with vast amounts of opportunity for each. Unfortunately, after this encounter, stealth is never really emphasized again throughout the game, other than maybe 2 other missions in the game, so its inclusion feels weirdly out of place. We don't even get a whole lot of equipment that would help us with stealth. In fact, you could be mistaken in thinking that there was no stealth in this game, with the amount of shotguns, rifles, and various other weapon types that create noise that would definitely alert the enemy to your location. But no, stealth is a part of the game, and you can even improve upon it in the VR training room, but it almost seems like Kojima doesn't want you to use it with the amount of weapons he gives you. Other than the rare few times the game incentivizes you to use stealth, I never used it again afterwards. In the first Death Stranding, while there was combat in the game, it was often pushed by the game itself that you avoid these encounters, and that running away is your best friend. The first game almost had this disdain for violence, as the weapons you had were very scarce, and it would take ages for you to get an upgrade or a new addition to your arsenal. This makes sense from both a narrative and gameplay perspective, as your main goal is not to get into fights, but to be connecting people around the world, and the discouragement of violence was needed in order to make that narrative work. However, despite my preference for Death Stranding 1's combat system, it is still the worst part of the game. The enemy AI is genuinely atrocious, as most of them just run at you without a thought in their mind. There's no strategy in their movements, it's just mindless. The gunplay was extremely clunky, and a defense I heard for this is that it was meant to be clunky, as combat is not the focus of the game, and Sam is not a fighter, he is a porter. At first I found this explanation to make some amount of sense, until I played Death Stranding 2. Unlike Death Stranding 1, where combat was present but often encouraged to be avoided, Death Stranding 2's combat is the complete opposite. Combat is everywhere in the game, and cannot be avoided. Despite violence being a message that the game is against, they actively attempt to justify it whenever it is brought to the forefront. And no matter what you say, there is more combat in Death Stranding 2. It is undeniable with how much more enemies are present and the continuous amount of guns to get in the game. While they attempt to justify this by having all the weapons be set to the non-lethal option when you get them, it comes across as Kojima wanting to have his cake and eat it too. It's a cheap way of trying to retain the core message he was trying to convey within the first game, but the way it is ham-fisted within the gameplay and story ultimately dilutes the message as a whole. He wants to make a game where the message is all about connection and how violence isn't the way, all while giving us 100 different variations of the grenade launcher. It's a very messy system that isn't given the proper care that it needs to be a satisfying combat system. Something that has remained unchanged from the first game is the like system. I had my fair share of issues with how they handled this system, but I wasn't too harsh on it, as I thought that if they were going to do a future installment, they'd improve on it, as this is the first Strand-type game after all. There were bound to be some things to improve upon. Oh, you sweet summer child, what a fool you were. Since the mechanics for the like system are exactly the same as the first game, I'll list off the criticisms I had when I finished playing the first game. I'd recommend watching Matthew Matosis's video on Death Stranding, as he goes into way more depth than I will for the like system, so go give his video a watch if you're curious. The main issue that I have with the like system is how cheap and arbitrary it all feels. The main defense I've heard for this is that it isn't supposed to be important. It's to show your support for others in the journey to connecting America to the chiral network. It's meant to be more of a metaphorical expression than anything meaningful. At a glance, this seems to be a decent way to demonstrate how much you can show your appreciation and see how far you've come in the journey to reconnecting America. But when you explore the system deeper than its surface level meaning, that's when I start to have my issues with it. I think that having small ways to show your appreciation is a cool little gameplay mechanic, but it's the implied impact that the mechanic apparently carries is when I become skeptical. There are many structures that you and other players can put down to help with their journey. Again, this is a really good concept, but the execution is poor, since we can never be sure just how many players this might help unless you get thousands of likes. Because of this, you never know the impact of your actions, and since you get thousands of likes from completing missions, the ones you get from placing down structures for other players get lumped in with the story-related likes. A possible fix for this is one that Matthew Matosis talked about in his video, that includes a mechanic where you can see other players in your world, so you can see the effect of how much you're helping your fellow porters. There are many issues that come with this suggestion, including the costs that require keeping the servers online, but this was more of a literal example of how you can see your actions having effect on others in the game, and there are plenty other ways to implement this idea without it feeling so disjointed in the process. It gets to a point where this mechanic could be faked, and you'd be none the wiser. It's not like you see anyone using your equipment, so your likes could be inflated by the game to possibly incentivize you further to place more structures for other porters. You may not see the big deal in this, but for a game that's whole premise is connection, this like system manages to achieve the complete opposite of what it originally set out to do. By making the like system so vague, it ends up making the player feel less connected and undermines the message of community and togetherness that both games try to achieve. For a mechanic that tries to be an inconsequential feature, both games sure do try to emphasize its apparent importance as you progress throughout the game. Whenever you kill an enemy or NPC in either game, the game will deduct a certain amount of likes from the player as a consequence. Usually it's around 1,000 likes, but from what I've heard, it increases to 3,000 if it's near a facility. The problem I have with this is how inconsequential of a punishment this is to the player for killing another person. As there are two ways you can deal with killing someone. You can either leave their body, or carry it all the way to an incinerator and burn it to avoid a void out. The contrast between these consequences is too vast for the player's decision to have any damning effect. Would you rather have some likes deducted that you could easily earn back without noticing, since you are constantly doing missions? Or would you want to take 10 minutes to deliver a corpse all the way to an incinerator so you don't trigger a void out? Yeah, sorry, but you can take the likes. I don't need them. It got so ridiculous to the point where I challenged myself on a separate playthrough to see if I could achieve a negative amount of likes to see if there was any consequence to even achieving that. Hilariously enough, I never managed to complete this challenge due to how quickly my likes would get replenished from completing missions, aid requests, and placing the occasional structure. Remember, this was me trying to lose as many likes as I could, and I still managed to fail, so the chances of this happening on the average casual playthrough is something I find to be extremely unlikely. You'd think there'd be a larger consequence for killing another human being, seeing how often the characters and the game itself reprimand you for doing so. But the consequence for it is practically non-existent, that it feels more like a slap on the wrist than something I would try avoid doing in the future. The consequence doesn't need to be anything incredibly harsh, just something that mildly inconveniences the player temporarily. It could be taking away the use of certain pieces of equipment for a few minutes, or something else entirely, but it needs to be something more than the reduction of something that doesn't impact you whatsoever. From what I've read online, you can get a worse delivery grade if you kill people, but I've never noticed this, nor do I care, as the grading of your performance in both games are just as equally inconsequential unless you fail to deliver the package. I know it seems strange to rant about an inherently useless feature, but it disappoints me in how little they tried to innovate with this mechanic, despite the amount of potential it had. Not to say that every single mechanic that is established in the first game needs to be improved or changed in the second, but for a feature that was so flawed from the start, you'd think that at the very least attempt something in order to improve upon it with the endless possibilities they had. Unfortunately, likes still remain an arbitrary feature that only serve for a quick dopamine rush for a few hours, until you begin to think about the mechanics of them for more than a couple of seconds. I mentioned porter grades a few seconds ago, and I feel like it's worth touching upon now, as porter grades and likes are essentially the same mechanic. Both are gameplay that is meant to give you some sense of satisfaction for getting them, and incentivize you to do better in the game. However, neither do a good job at enforcing this. Getting a C ranking is basically the same as getting an A at the end of the day. You still get the equipment the game wants you to collect, and unless you're doing a completionist run where you try to 5-star all the facilities, porter grades will be even more meaningless to you. The worst that would happen is the dialogue from the NPC receiving the package will be a little different. Instead of getting a compliment, you get a compliment with the most minor complaints. I've seen Amazon delivery drivers get treated like shit if the packaging isn't in pristine condition, and you're telling me that in an apocalypse setting where every resource matters, the people running these facilities aren't going to be picky? What kind of utopia are they fucking living in? Sam could come back with the most mangled ass package you would ever lay your eyes upon, along with Sam's spit on it, and these no backbone having motherfuckers would say, "Oh, well, this package may be smashed to pieces, with clearly no regard for its condition, and only barely recoverable, but we still love you, Sam. You keep doing you, King." The whole point of the gameplay in the first game was patience and making every step you take count. Will you take one package or 10? Whatever option you pick will have consequences. As the more packages you hold, the more patience that will be required from you. While Death Stranding 2 spits on that concept alone, I will say that in both games, the inconsequential nature of porter grades lessens the impact of all that effort you put into getting those packages to that specific facility. All that effort you put in, and it's condensed down to an artificial grade that hardly changes anything. After a while, it becomes less satisfying and more pointless. Why should I care about how I'm going to get this cargo from point A to B as carefully as I can, if running around like an asshole and falling down mountaintops to get there doesn't make the slightest difference? Death Stranding 2 makes this concept even more obsolete with the inclusion of vehicle upgrades, hoverboards, and much more. While we will go into more depth about these things, that doesn't change the fact that Death Stranding's original goal was to be almost like a walking simulator through and through. While there were tools that would aid you along the way in your journey, at its core, Death Stranding wanted to make hooking up the UCA feel earned by taking your time setting everything up. Like the like system, I was hopeful that the system would be improved upon, but alas, it was not. Facilities are another feature that are present in both games, but it irritates me heavily in Death Stranding 2. You're beginning to see a trend here, but with hooking up facilities, the core gameplay loop remains the same, as it should from an execution standpoint. There's not much I would change up about hooking up facilities, but rather how we are able to hook them up. In both games, the formula is that you come across an individual or individuals who represent their facility. Whether the facility is populated with one person or thousands makes the slightest bit of difference. The whole point is that it is transactional. Either they want something so they can see that you can be trusted, or they start off wanting nothing to do with you until you prove yourself to them. I'm fine with this premise as a whole, but I wish they added a bit more challenge to it in the second game. How they managed to do this in the first game was by, instead of the person in charge of the facility letting you connect immediately, you would have to do another mission for them in order to properly earn their trust. In the first game I liked it, but like other parts of the game, it definitely had room for expansion. To my surprise, there are even less facilities that require you to do more than one delivery in order to get them hooked up to the chiral network. In the first game, they were almost constant in its second half, but in the sequel they are almost non-existent. I find this to be quite surprising, as there is so much they could have done with challenging the player to hook up the chiral network. It had already been established in the first game that there were plenty of folk who were unwilling to join the chiral network unless you did a couple missions for them. In the second game, they could have expanded upon this further. Maybe there was one facility that could be exploiting you for your hard work, with the promise of letting you hook them up to the chiral network. Maybe there are some that would take 4 deliveries. These aren't the most fleshed out ideas in the world, but you get the idea. The sequel does nothing to expand upon these ideas to make them the same. It especially becomes quite dull when you're aiming for an 100% completionist achievement like I was, because the most challenge I would ever come across was every once in a blue moon when one of the people in charge would tell me to deliver 2 packages to connect them to the chiral facility instead of 1. I spent a good 40 hours getting 5 stars on every facility in Australia, and in my time of playing games, I have done the completionist route for many of them. Some have been quite difficult, others fairly easy to accomplish. However, I don't think I've ever come across something as mind-numbingly brain-dead as Death Stranding 2's requirements for 100% completion. When hearing this, some of you may say, well, if you have a problem with it, then don't do it. No one is forcing you to. And in most cases, I wouldn't have bothered. The days of trying to 100% games are way behind me, but it's different when reviewing games. As a casual player, it is unlikely for you to experience everything in the game, unless your game is My Name is Mayo. The entire point of a game is the experience you get from it, and when you finish a game, you most likely only get a part of that experience. The whole purpose of putting side content in your game should ideally be for the players who love your game so much that they want to experience more of it after having finished the main stuff. There is a reason why Cyberpunk 2077 is one of my favorite games ever made, and while it is a partial bias towards my love for the cyberpunk genre, it is also because the game actively cares about player experience. The game has a vast amount of side content, all of which are almost always completely optional. Deciding to engage with the side content left me mostly satisfied, as I felt like I was uncovering new content where I was able to learn more about the game I loved. For example, there is this one mission that V is tasked with, which is the handling of a sentient vending machine. This concept alone is absolutely bonkers, and the game is heavily aware of that. It turns out that the reason that this vending machine is getting shut down is because it has become more of a therapist than anything. It still sells items, but it listens to your problems along with it. Because of this, the owners want to reset it, because it has been selling less due to its newly gained sentience. This mission tells you a lot about the world of Cyberpunk, whilst giving you some intriguing world building. After playing this series of missions, I found myself even more engrossed in Cyberpunk's world in comparison to Death Stranding 2's. While Cyberpunk uses side content to explore different corners of Night City through weird and wacky concepts, Death Stranding 2 does seemingly the opposite. I would describe the way Death Stranding 2 incorporates its gameplay as anti-gameplay. You are tasked with the same repetitive cycle of doing the exact same set of orders over and over again that it drives you crazy after a couple hours of doing them. I've heard some people say that the repetition within Death Stranding 2 is purposeful, that it is the whole point. That this has been Kojima's philosophy within Death Stranding 2 the whole time, and I would heavily disagree. While the game heavily mirrors the plot of the first, there is nothing within its story or gameplay that acknowledges that it is the same. And even if this was the case, then they executed it in the most lazy and uncreative way they could have done it. There are so many ways to tackle repeating plot lines, and the best that Kojima has got is to repeat the story of the first game and hardly expand upon the gameplay in any meaningful way. I'm sorry, but I'm not buying it. In Death Stranding 2, you are given 3 different types of missions you can complete if you want to achieve a 5-star rank on every facility. You can either deliver packages, retrieve packages and deliver them, or fight a boss of some kind. From my experience, the first 2 is what you'll find yourself doing the most, but every so often you'll find yourself in a mini boss fight. We'll touch upon the bosses and enemy variety soon, but I'm sure you'll hardly find it surprising that I'm not a fan of them either. Because of the lack of variety when doing facility orders, it makes doing a completionist route that much more of a slog. While you do get optional dialogue trees for further information about weapons or what's going on around them, most of the time they'll talk about stuff going outside the facility that we either already knew about or got told in the first game. It's so uninteresting, and it makes me wish we got some dialogue options that pertain to the struggles going on in their facility, rather than getting a quick mention of it. But we hardly ever get that, and instead the game decides to expand upon things that hardly matter or things we already know about. I think I might have been a bit forgiving if there were less facilities to go through. I'm not quite sure how much bigger the Australia map is in comparison to the America one, but I've heard it being described from anywhere to twice as big as the America map to being 3 times bigger. Either way, this not only makes the distance between each facility to be longer, but there's also more facilities to hook up compared to the first game. In Death Stranding 1, there are 39 facilities, which is already quite the hefty amount. In fact, I'd argue that it's too many, but in Death Stranding 2, they saw the facility count and decided to add 3 more facilities into the mix. There's nothing particularly special about these facilities, they only added them for what I guess to be padding out the maps. There's not much more to do in Death Stranding 2 than to hook up facilities, and it makes the large open world feel like wasted potential than anything. There's not a whole lot going for the map of Death Stranding 2 on its own, so to make up for it, they spammed a bunch of facilities along Australia to compensate for the lack of variety in the environment. I feel as if they should have cut down on the amount of facilities, and focused more on different ways to make the game have a bit more substance to it. Maybe instead of giving the player so many facilities to hook up, they could have put that effort into developing more of the characters, because at this point, hooking up the facilities feels more like a chore than an accomplishment. While Death Stranding 1 did have a similar amount, the map was a whole lot more compact, and the environments were tougher to traverse through to make the deliveries a little more challenging. The second game's environments are mostly condensed down to flat terrain, with the occasional rock or mountain to climb. It makes the map size a lot less justifiable, and felt like it was mainly there as an accomplishment from a technological standpoint compared to a gameplay one. A small nitpick I have with these facilities that bugs me quite a bit is how the design has been essentially ripped from the first game without any changes whatsoever. It feels so lazy that they could have changed up the design a little bit for some of the facilities in this game, but they all have the same grey, sterile look to them that makes it feel like bad game design than an intentional choice. Okay, I promise that's the last you'll hear of me talking about the facilities for a good while, as I want to talk about the environment of Death Stranding 2 a little more. When it comes to environmental hazards, there are significantly less that are introduced within the game than I thought there would be. Even the new ones that have been introduced, like the earthquakes, flooding, and avalanches, are all disappointing in their own ways, as they are more minor inconveniences than obstacles that you need to actively avoid. At the start of the game, it was emphasized by Fragile that these variables will be major hindrances on my journey, and that I should try my best to avoid them. Interestingly, from what I found out on subsequent playthroughs, are that these environments are not as natural as I had originally thought they would be. You see, in most games, there are usually systems that pertain to the game's environment, whether that be the feature of rain, avalanches, etc. Usually they are randomized when playing to give a sense of unpredictability, to make the game more immersive. However, this seems to not be the case in Death Stranding 2, as I found a majority of the obstacles I encountered to be largely scripted. In other games, this would hardly make any other difference, as most AAA games are largely linear, so it makes sense for a lot of the environments to be scripted. Take Uncharted as an example once again. And even if they weren't, it wouldn't matter to begin with. The reason I take issue with this in Death Stranding 2 is that the environment is hinged upon being dynamic for it to work. The whole challenge of it is in the gameplay. Getting cargo from point A to B sounds simple enough in theory, but with the amount of variables to get through, it makes it a lot more difficult in its execution. The first game navigated this quite well, as the environment almost adapted once you started to get better. The second vehicles were introduced, you got moved to a separate map entirely, where even with vehicles, you still needed to remain cautious. And while I do have my issues with the vehicles in both games, the point I am trying to make is that the first game at least succeeded in some small way to make the environment more dynamic. We hardly get any of that here, because once you realize that a majority of the obstacles are scripted within the environment, it only makes the game feel all the more cheap. Not only are the obstacles scripted, but when you come across them, they hardly present any sort of challenge at all. At the beginning of the game, you're told about earthquakes and flooding. Earthquakes, or gatequakes as the game like to call them, are quite asinine, as the ground merely shakes a bit, and a couple of rocks will come falling down. From my experience, you often have enough time to dodge them, but if you can't, then it's no big deal, as the times I did get hit by these things were often largely inconsequential. Flooding is probably the most useless and laughable out of all the environmental hazards, as I've only come across it about 2 times out of the 5 playthroughs I've completed of Death Stranding 2. When it has occurred, it's pretty easy to walk away from them as they take forever to rise. When I first heard about Fragile describing how dangerous the floods would be, I was more locked in than I ever had been before. I thought it was going to be a test of skill, luck, and the right amount of reflexes to make it out of there alive. But no, it was more lackluster than anything. From what I can tell from watching other players' videos when they have gone the flood, it doesn't seem to be particularly dramatic, as it is constantly set between 2 states, low and high. I don't know why Kojima thought this was acceptable, but the quantity of floods needs to be raised. And I actually want the floods to feel like an obstacle to traverse through. This isn't just my preference, by the way, the game itself calls these challenges. For a 2-year-old, maybe, but this was more of a joke to me than anything. Avalanches are another rarity, where I only managed to encounter 6 or 7 throughout my 5 playthroughs. Like floods, they can be avoided relatively simply by stepping to the side. I swear the environmental hazards have one weakness like kryptonite, and that's just by stepping to the side. The only time an avalanche managed to get to me was when I had my back turned, and I was talking to someone else. I'm not quite sure what I'd offer for improvement for the avalanches, but it needs to be something that forces you to go outside of your regular playstyle. I shouldn't have to sidestep about 10 inches in order to avoid an avalanche. I should be panicking for my life to make sure I'm not caught up in that beast too. Dust storms, from my experience, have always been a scripted encounter. I don't think in my hours of playing I've seen a naturally occurring dust storm. Same goes for fire, but we'll talk about that aspect more in a second. When I've encountered dust storms, all they've managed to do is make my vehicle run a little slower, and if you're on ground, it might reduce your stamina more than usual. The big appeal of them, though, is how they reduce your vision, which, if implemented well, could be a neat mechanic. Although you probably know what I'm about to say next, and that's that they are not implemented well at all. In fact, they can be easily countered by using your Orodex scanner to traverse the landscape. I don't know why, but for some reason whoever playtested this either never bothered to use the Orodex scanner, or simply never told the devs about this broken feature, as they never once temporarily disabled the Orodex. I have my suspicions that this game either wasn't playtested enough, or they got the wrong people for the job, because there's some seriously broken elements in this game that should have been noticeable within the first few hours of testing, but we'll talk about that more in a bit. They could have come up with some bullshit about how dust storms messes with your equipment, so your Orodex scanner will temporarily be unavailable during this period, thus making the feature ultimately quite useless. The fire mechanic is something that has the most potential out of them all, but is a feature I almost forgot to mention in the script because it only occurred one time in each playthrough, so I'm hesitant to even call it a part of the weather system, but then I realized that it had to have meant to occur more than once, as they gave you the tar cannon for dealing with fires like those in the future. So either they simply forgot to put in fire as a consistent issue for Sam to deal with, or the tar cannon is another useless Death Stranding item that is only used once. Oh yes, there are more than one of those types of items, and they all have their special place in hell. I won't drag on them too much here, as I think the tar cannon simply speaks for itself as a tool that you use once and never again. Even when you acquire it when all hell is breaking loose, you don't even need to use it on the fire, and every other playthrough of this game I always tried to make the section more challenging for myself by getting through the fire without using the tar cannon at all. To my surprise, not only was it more effective to simply double jump over the flames, but I still managed to gain an S ranking by doing this every single time, which makes the tar cannon even more obsolete, as there's not even a need to use it. To give the fire section some credit, I will say that I was way more active in comparison to simply moving my joystick to the side to avoid the incoming obstacle. In fact, I would say this was the only weather mechanic or natural disaster, more like scripted disasters, where I actually had to slightly adapt my playstyle in order to avoid taking damage to Sam or my cargo. I may even say that by removing the tar cannon entirely, it would make the section a lot more interesting as a whole. There's just one tiny hair in the soup, and that's that it only occurred once throughout my entire playthrough as a scripted event. I think I've seen it once more when doing my 100% completionist run, but that could have been my mind creating illusions due to how bored I was throughout the entire thing, so I'll just count it as once. It's quite disappointing because, like most of the things I've talked about already in Death Stranding 2, it holds so much potential, but it is squandered by either the devs being too lazy to expand upon it further, or Kojima's lack of understanding about video games. And before people attack me for saying that, Kojima himself has admitted to only playing games maybe once a year. So yeah, I don't think he has a proper grasp of gaming, or at least not as much as he used to. But then again, maybe I might think differently when going back to his other titles. In any case, the weather system and or natural disasters mechanic had so much going for it, but ultimately falls flat on its face. Surprisingly enough, the core issues I have with it are relatively simple to fix. Raise the quantity of these events so that they can occur more frequently, instead of making it the same odds of seeing a unicorn appear in front of my eyes. I know that would require you to make the system a bit more randomized, but as someone who has done game design before, it shouldn't take you that long to make it happen. Then there are the severity of these events, to which almost all of them have the impact of a wet noodle. One thing I would suggest, if you want to keep the severity of these events the way they are for whatever reason that may be, is to simply increase the severity if the player chooses to play on a higher difficulty. It not only makes the game feel a bit more balanced, but it would also improve the game's shitty difficulty system. Oh right, speaking of which, the difficulty system might be one of the worst I've seen in a long time. Something you should know about me is when I play a game for the first time, I usually play on the hardest difficulty available, because to me it makes the game a lot more enjoyable to me. However, since I was streaming my first playthrough, I decided to lower the difficulty to a normal setting, so everyone wouldn't see me get stuck on the same boss for 2 hours straight. At least, that's what I thought I did until around the halfway mark, when I noticed that these regular enemies were more bullet spongy than they should be for a normal playthrough. So I went to check the difficulty system, and I realized that I had been playing on hard the entire time. If that entire story doesn't tell you how shit the difficulty of this game is, then I really don't know what does. The whole game I went along thinking that I was playing on normal, when in reality I was playing on hard, and I never grew suspicious until halfway. To add more context to this, I hadn't used my PS5 for playing games in about a year, which meant that for a couple hours, I had to get used to playing a PS5 game instead of how I regularly play games on PC. Often when I hear people complaining about the difficulty in Death Stranding 2, a valid complaint I may add, many fans of the game fire back by saying that either the difficulty isn't the point of the game, or they should play in offline mode. Both of these points are ridiculous retorts to very valid complaints. Players should not have to nerf themselves in order to fix what the developers couldn't do themselves. If playing online makes the game easier, then that is a problem that has to do with the people who made the game. In fact, I'm quite surprised how they didn't try to limit supplies from others the more the difficulty was increased. I know that people will cite how the difficulty isn't the point, but rather how connection is the focal point. But what makes that connection satisfying is the journey to get there. This is something that even the first game understood, despite not always doing a perfect job at implementing it. The only changes I had noticed when completing the game on the hardest difficulty was that the enemies were more bullet spongy, and that Sam took more damage than he would on lower difficulties. And that's it. Those are the two most notable changes about the hardest difficulty, and if that's all they could really think of doing to make the game harder for the player, then I've got to say that I'm extremely disappointed. There's so much you could change to make the difficulty actually difficult, rather than going the lazy route of making all the enemies do more damage and make Sam take more damage in the process. I even pointed out a few earlier, and it's disappointing to see that none of that was taken into consideration whilst designing the harder difficulties. It would have been neat to see how the harder difficulties impact the delivery side of gameplay, but from what I had experienced, I didn't see much of a difference. The only thing that's impacted is the combat, and with the amount of weapons you're given, and how predictably easy the bosses are to take down, hard mode becomes like any other difficulty in the game, except instead of taking 2 minutes to kill a boss, it now takes 6. So unless you suck at focusing on something for more than 2 minutes, hard mode should be a breeze. Continuing my discussion about the bosses and enemies from earlier, I think it's about time I discuss the enemy variety within the game. I think that the enemy variety starts off decently strong at the beginning. The enemies, especially the BTs, are more intimidating than they were in the previous game. Unfortunately, the main issue I have with them ultimately ties into the brain-dead combat in the game. You see, the reason why these enemies are so intimidating is due to the limited resources you have in the first few hours of the game, but afterwards it becomes a non-issue, and that fear that you felt in your first encounter turns into irritation as you have to defeat yet another BT. You get so many weapons in your arsenal that none of it feels like a challenge. It's more mindless than anything. The enemies were already pretty simplistic and easy to beat in the first game, but due to the lack of weapons you had, it was challenging enough. The second game instead does an interesting technique called not learning what made the first game so good, as it gives you more weapons than you can handle. Which is why I think it's an issue on both sides. The enemies are not made to be difficult enough to justify the weapon variety, and the weapon variety is too much that it goes against the message of the first game. We've already talked about my issues with the weapons earlier in the video, so now we'll discuss how much I dislike the enemy varieties, because there are a lot of them. I think beach things have undergone the biggest changes in the game, which is funny to say because I never knew there were different types. Instead, while I was streaming, I had someone else in the chat tell me near the end of the game that I was fighting different types of BTs, and I was none the wiser the whole time. Nevertheless, I hardly noticed much of a difference to the BTs even on the hardest difficulty, so that should say a lot already. I typically tend to avoid them, but if I ever get caught by them, I typically resort to one of two methods: pissing on them or pulling out one of the hundreds of weapons I have and killing it quickly before moving on. In all honesty, the pissing mechanic might be way too OP now, considering the amount of tools you have to fight back against the BTs. While I do think it is a funny feature, they should have either nerfed it or gotten rid of it entirely. The amount of times I could cheese this mechanic just so I could deliver my packages faster was more than I could count. So to summarize my thoughts about the BT varieties, it's that they could have been so good if not for the fact that you have the weapon arsenal of Rambo throughout the game. There's also the newly added ghost mechs. There's nothing too special about them as a whole. I think in an entirely different game, they would work fine as some basic placeholder enemies, but for a Death Stranding game, I can't help but feel as if they are out of place. Every interaction you have with them is an encounter that forces you into combat. There is no way to stealth kill them. Believe me, I have tried. Again, this ties back into the game's illusion of choice when it comes to approaching combat. The game will tell you that stealth is an option, however, in most cases it is not. Even when it is, it's a lot more inconvenient and monotonous than just blindly looting and shooting. It's not like you get any significant rewards for using the stealth mechanics, so it's basically obsolete. And as I've explained before, due to the terrible difficulty settings, the only time they would ever pose a slight challenge is on the hardest difficulty. Even then, they can be defeated relatively easily with a couple blasts from the shotgun. Most of the time when I see them out in the wild, I tend to try and avoid them for my own leisure. Similarly to the ghost mechs, we have the mules. The mules, like the ghost mechs, are very standard placeholder enemies. In the first game, I had my issues with them, but I always felt at the bare minimum some small amount of tension when I'd come across them, whether that be when they spotted me in the wild and would try to poach some of my packages, or when I was breaking into one of the camps for an item I'd need to progress the plot. They were enemies that I would dread running into. Despite that, a constant issue I would notice whenever I would run into them is their AI being, let's face it, really bad for modern AAA standards. They don't incorporate a whole lot of strategy to them other than throwing themselves at the player. They don't attempt to hide or outsmart the player, they are simply brain dead. While I would be more forgiving of these mistakes if it was from any other developer, I'm more willing to criticize Kojima for it in both Death Stranding games, as Metal Gear Solid 5 had some incredible combat and great enemy AI for the time when it was released. To see a developer whose enemy AI used to be some of the best in the industry has now been downgraded to this was nothing short of disappointing. Unsurprisingly, this issue has remained unfixed, and has gotten worse in the second game now that there is an overabundance of weapons to kill the mules with. Because of their lack of adaptment, I find the AI to be worse than the first game. In fact, they've removed certain elements from the mules that made them so interesting in the first game. The biggest example is that the mules used to actively attempt to chase after you for your stuff. This is no longer a feature in the sequel. Not only does this give the enemies less agency than they already had, but makes them a whole lot less intimidating in comparison to the first. The only time I had a small amount of difficulty when dealing with the mules was when one of the enemy varieties could clone themselves. The reason I say small amount of difficulty is because the way to quickly defeat one of these is by simply pulling out a shotgun or a grenade and going to town on them. It's such a mindless way to engage the player in combat, and incentivizes a lack of adaptability from the player. You could stick with the same weapon for the whole game, and would find yourself in little trouble along the way. That's partly why these new weapons are terrible. There's no need to ever use one of them. None of the attacks or enemy types ever require you, as the player, to change your weapon to take them down. In fact, in my second playthrough, I wanted to see how far you could get by maining the same weapon, and apart from some sections where playing with another weapon is mandatory, I never found any reason to stop using my shotgun. In my third playthrough, I tried to make use of every gun I was given, however it quickly became quite overwhelming due to the sheer amount of weapons that was constantly added to my repertoire. Dealing with the mules or any enemy is mind-numbing and brain-dead. It requires no critical thought or strategy when dealing with them whatsoever. And before anyone says that Death Stranding 1 was the same, well, that's because the first Death Stranding didn't emphasize combat as heavily as its sequel. Therefore, the onus is on this game to make a combat system that is not only challenging but satisfying too. The same goes for the boss fights. With every boss fight I encountered, the worse they got, with Higgs's final boss fight being probably one of the worst boss fights I've played in a while. We'll touch a bit more on that later, but I think it's laughable how lacking the bosses are in terms of variety and difficulty. Ironically, the first boss you face in the game is possibly the best, but that's not saying a lot. The attacks are extremely repetitive, and once you get hit a couple times by it, it becomes pretty easy to predict what will happen next. However, considering it is a first boss, I am a lot more forgiving of these things, as they are to try and get the player accustomed to the combat mechanics. What I won't forgive is when I can't differentiate between the first and one of the late game bosses. Every single one of these bosses' attacks are predictable, simplistic, and can be easily combated by simply running to the side for a couple of seconds. This is something I'd expect to see from the first couple of bosses, not from a late game boss, especially with the amount of weapons this game generously gifts you. It causes a massive imbalance within the combat, because the bosses remain practically stagnant while you as the player get more powerful. Finding balance in the mechanics is something the game struggles with immensely, not just in the combat, but many other gameplay mechanics as well. However, I'd argue that the imbalance in the combat is the most offensive out of them all. What's even more shocking is when I decide to note down all the bosses I had to face off against as future references for the script. And 3 of the 9 bosses you fight are the exact same. For all 3 of the giant octopus mech boss fights, they follow almost the same formula to a T. The boss has around 3 movesets, they execute them, rest, and then repeat. These movesets are basically the same as before, and to defeat it, all you have to do is shoot the obvious orange spots. The fights don't evolve into something slightly more difficult. Like for example, the final boss will have some sort of protection over the orange spots, so you have to shoot them, before shooting its weaknesses. I know it's a very basic example, but I'm not the one who's making the game. Unfortunately, they remain practically the same. Remember, this is a third of the boss encounters you'll have in the game, which means you'll have to go through the same repetitive attacks with little to no evolution that amps up the difficulty as you progress through the game. It honestly feels like filler more than anything, as I'm not sure the purpose of it. It doesn't test your skill set in any other way than in maybe its first encounter, so the only conclusion I can come to is that this was done deliberately to extend the game's runtime. It's nothing more than a copy-paste boss fight, and its existence tells me the little amount of care that was put into designing them. While the bosses weren't anything notable in the first game, in fact they were probably the worst part of the game, I don't think I was ever this miserable when I fought any boss in Death Stranding 1 in comparison to the second game's boss fights. The worst offender in Death Stranding 2 would have to be the Nirvana boss fights, if you can even count them as boss fights. They are more like encounters than anything else in all honesty. While I hated the giant octopus mech for its repetitive encounters, it doesn't hold a candle to the Nirvana sections. All my complaints about the combat sections, boss fights, and combat mechanics is rolled into one with the Nirvana fights. Every section is the exact same, where you shoot Nirvana, he runs away, you shoot him again, he runs away, then you shoot him for a final time, and it triggers a cutscene. I'm not kidding when I say that this is what happens for every encounter with Nirvana. This is where the enemy AI is possibly at its worst. They all rush at you and shoot you in a semi-enclosed space, and since there's not a whole lot of strategy to fighting these enemies, you start to feel the monotony once they make you do this constantly for every encounter. Actually, scratch that, it becomes repetitive when you have to chase down Nirvana for the second time, after having mindlessly fired bullets into him. It's hard to describe what is so bad about the Nirvana sections without citing what I've complained about earlier for the previous boss fights. There's almost no change in the future encounters, nothing that challenges you, nothing to make you use your arsenal to your advantage. It's all the same with the exception of 1 or 2 qualities that makes the environment a little more unique. For example, the second encounter has these ice pillar structures that freeze you if you go near them. It's fine enough on its own, but if that's the only other challenge you have to offer for the second encounter with Nirvana, then it hardly makes a difference. There's not a whole lot of progression with these encounters other than from a narrative standpoint. And even then, it's not a whole lot of progression there either. But from a gameplay perspective, you could swap these encounters around, except for maybe the last due to the story implications, and it wouldn't really make a difference. Something else that is immediately apparent in every boss fight I've encountered is the awkward UI menus. This was an issue I encountered in the first game, and kind of a general issue rather than a combat one, and I will concede that the game has fixed some of the issues for the UI, but a lot of them are still present. The only reason I decided to talk about in the combat section, instead of making it its own section, is because this is where the UI is at its worst. The UI is extremely clunky to sort through during boss fights. I can't count the amount of times I went to open a menu to switch to a different weapon, only to find out I didn't select it was appalling. A better alternative would have been to have a button that switches between weapons for efficiency, as it would save more time and you wouldn't need to go through a bunch of menus to get there. The button configuration is also not great. For example, the reload button is exactly the same as the punch button, so at times it became quite a frustrating experience to get Sam to do what I wanted. Again, this was a problem in the first game, but I'll say it again. Combat was not as heavily emphasized as it has been in this game, so these issues should have been sorted out before the game was released. This is what depresses me about the Nirvana sections. For a character who's supposed to be so important, his encounters are surprisingly unimportant. Sure, they look nice, they look incredible from a graphical standpoint, but the same can be said for the rest of the game, and if that's all you have to offer with your boss fights, then chances are I'm not going to care for any of them. And don't even get me started on the final boss fight between Higgs and Sam. The game feels like it is trying so hard to be cool that it almost feels desperate. The fact is, since none of these character or plot beats are satisfying, these cool payoff moments don't work nearly as well as they want them to. Sure, beating Higgs by having a riff-off is cool in concept, but without any of the good writing, it devolves into hype moments in aura territory. There's not a whole lot of challenge to his boss either. In fact, out of all the bosses in the game, Higgs' boss fight is by far the easiest. The first section is completed by using your guitar to kill him, but you can simply go up to him and punch his lights out, and that will also do the trick. Which, looking back on it, I'm not sure if that was intentional or not, as Higgs wouldn't know how to react when I pulled that move out. The second section is more of that, except this time he can hide behind the gravestones. Then the final section is executed in a similar vein to the first game, except with more hype moments in aura, and some Metal Gear Solid references. It all feels so lazy and uninspired that I honestly feel nothing when going through these. It's so weird because they place such an important emphasis on combat in the second game, but at the same time, it's almost as if the people who designed these sections weren't very confident in what they had created. The bosses and combat encounters throughout the game have a lack of progression to them and remain quite stagnant throughout. There's little to no creativity to be found within these sections, and that leaves a lot to be desired from these parts of the game. In fact, they seem to be so unconfident in what they had created that they put a skip feature for any of the boss encounters. I'm not kidding, there is a skip feature for the boss fights. I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of it is for though, because the bosses themselves are not challenging. So I've been trying to figure out what the purpose of them are, but to me it shows a severe lack of confidence in what you have made. That may not be the reason, but if your boss fights are this monotonous and repetitive, then there's not a whole lot of a conclusion I can come to other than a lack of confidence in what you've created. Vehicles have always been an oddity to me in both Death Stranding entries, as their implementations have been shaky at best. The entire point of the first Death Stranding was a challenge, and yet bikes and other modes of transport are there to make your journey a whole lot easier without any real difficulty curve. While driving them could be quite janky, the difference between walking and driving is simply unbalanced. Death Stranding 2 had the perfect opportunity to give vehicles the perfect player balance possible without making things unrealistically difficult. You can probably see where this is going, but not only did Death Stranding 2 not fix the unbalanced gameplay, they actually managed to somehow make it worse. Unlike in the first game, I can't simply point to one issue that needs to be fixed, but instead there are now multiple, all make this baffling design choice. For Death Stranding 2, they want to add vehicle upgrades. Now, don't get me wrong, a couple of these upgrades are warranted, like the sticky cannon. This is a genuinely good upgrade, as it saves time without making things too convenient for the player. It saves a couple seconds of having to get out of the vehicle, go to the package, grab it, and then go back into the vehicle. There's nothing much I can say about it other than it's a genuinely good upgrade. But then there's the upgrades that belong in the deepest pits of hell, never to resurface back to the overworld, for it is a cursed being. May I introduce you to the battery unit. There's a reason why I used to look back fondly at the times where I would see a generator in the first game and my vehicle's battery was practically dead, and the situation became a life and death struggle to get to the generator before it was too late. I would try my hardest, and just when I thought I was going to make it, battery dead. It was right there I would take a quick moment to reflect. Could I have gone the generator had I not taken that specific route? Maybe if I wasn't so careful with the BTs, I could have gone there on time. Many what-if scenarios would plague my mind. And while I did have my complaints about the vehicles in the first game, it was those moments that would make me strive to try and be more efficient with the vehicles. You see, without any of the battery packs, there was an actual challenge when you would try to make it to the nearest generator. But now it's the complete opposite. I don't think in one of my playthroughs I have ever come close to running out of battery, and that's mainly due to battery packs. The battery packs give you too much, not to mention that there are 6 slots available to upgrade them further. So it's not even like this is a one-time upgrade that gives you a little more battery. No, these upgrades can be insanely overpowered, and will give you the power of 2 pickup off-roaders and 1. These small little battery packs took what was one of the few challenging aspects about vehicles, and have made them into vices that almost feel like you are cheating when you use one. Not only are they faster, but I'm never going to run out of battery unlike Sam, who has limited stamina. Even if there wasn't one around me for whatever reason, I'd stocked up on so many PCCs that I could live off them if I wanted to. While there is a complaint I could draw with the sheer amount of chiral crystals, I can't be bothered at this point, as the whole thing is a symptom of a larger issue. While I did say that the battery units were mainly the issue, I won't blame them entirely, as the developers could have done something else to combat this problem, which is putting a limit to the amount of structures that are in the game. I'm almost convinced that there are twice as many structures that generate near you in comparison to Death Stranding 1, because I don't think I could walk 2 steps without seeing a generated structure. Now, I understand that you want to show the themes of connection from a gameplay perspective, and that's fine, but you couldn't at least limit the generators? Now, I know a lot of people are going to tell me that if I don't like it, then I should simply go into offline mode and go from there. But if a game's features are so broken that I have to turn them off entirely in order to avoid them, then that is an issue on the developer's front, and fixing the game for them is not something I, as the player, should be doing. The fact is that vehicles are broken, and in a way, it seems like the devs saw the issue with vehicles in the first game, and instead of trying to improve upon them, they gave up and decided to take the easy way out by making them easier to operate, thus giving the player no reason to do deliveries on foot. And I haven't even begun to talk about the coffin board yet, which is arguably worse than any of the vehicle upgrades that have been introduced. Essentially is a very fast mode of transportation that is limited within the chiral network, meaning that if you try to go outside of the chiral network with it, it simply won't let you. This would all be well and good if it weren't for the fact that you could only get this item near the end of the game, which by that point you would have already hooked up all the facilities to the chiral network, so there's not a whole lot stopping you from being the speediest delivery boy known to man. Sure, the battery life on it is low, but it's like I said before, you can't go a second without seeing some randomly generated structure, so the chances of your board running out before coming across a generator is low, and even then I always had some spare PCCs with me whenever I'd go out, so even if I couldn't find one, it was still never an issue. Do you all see now how the gameplay for this game goes against everything that the first game was about? The game is so conflicted with you needing to take in your environment, whilst at the same time wanting you to zoom left and right to every location, that it feels like it is trying to please everyone at once. Even the mere act of building roads feels tedious. because the reward for it all is that the game gives you an autopilot feature where you don't even have to play the game, and it will do the driving for you. How did we go from the first Strand type game to the first non-game type game? While we're on the topic of traversal, I may as well address the big elephant in the room. Fast travel. At the beginning of the game, Fragile mentions that she has jump shock. This is due to her over-reliance on teleporting herself to the beach too many times. Originally, when I heard Fragile talking about this, I became quite interested, as I thought that fast travel was no longer going to be a thing, and if it was going to be continued, it would be harder to do so now. However, it turns out that Fragile's condition hardly affects the gameplay and narrative at all. While it does become important towards the very end of the game, it's not developed well enough for me to care. Not to mention the fact that this piece of information becomes even more redundant when 2 more fast travel options get introduced later on. While both have their drawbacks, I'm still mixed on their inclusion in the game. On one hand, they do offer a sort of penalty system for using them whilst delivering cargo, showing that they are not supposed to be relied upon very often. On the other hand, I'm still not very fond of both games having the ability to fast travel practically whenever you want, as it kind of detracts from the core gameplay loop of delivering packages. Especially when it only costs you a couple of extra minutes to get to said location, not to mention the inordinate amount of equipment you would have gathered by the time fast travel has been unlocked, which makes the entire purpose of it feel useless. Personally, I would often go out of my way to avoid these as much as I could. I much prefer spending an extra couple of minutes getting to my location, rather than teleporting around with little to no consequence at all. It makes the game feel easier than it already is, and that is saying a lot. Speaking of cheap, floating carriers make a return from the first game. While their abilities were already quite overpowered, it's almost like someone on the development team looked at how overpowered they were and decided that they still weren't overpowered enough, and so dialed them up to 11. While granted they were an easy way to get an S rank on your packages, if you took fall damage they would come undone, if you fucked up badly they would also come undone, and if you attempted to climb a mountain with a lot of ridges to it, you guessed it, they would come undone. Basically, while it was the way to getting an easy S, the first game would still encourage you to take it slow. Whereas in the sequel, you could try and fuck up all you want, and it's very unlikely that the floating carriers will unattach themselves from you. The only time they will is if you're actively trying to get them to unattach from you, and in a casual playthrough, that is quite unlikely. Not to mention that you can now enter cars with one equipped, whereas in the first game you were not allowed to. I appreciated it at the time because it told me that if you were going to commit to one style of gameplay, you should just commit to it. While it's not a big deal that you can do it in the second game, it does peeve me off just a little. Honestly, there's not much I can say about the floating carriers without it just sounding like I'm repeating the same point. That's how it feels to describe the gameplay of Death Stranding 2. At the end of the day, it all loops back to the same issue, that being that it was too lazy to innovate. It doesn't need to, and it doesn't want to. This game doesn't cater towards people who loved the first game. It is catering towards the people who want another Metal Gear Solid game, or a game that seems cool and action-packed. The fact is that Death Stranding 2's gameplay is not gameplay, it's anti-gameplay. It's meant to be extremely flashy, but behind it all, it is mindless tedium. I made this video out of the love I have for Death Stranding 1, because I simply did not like this game. I do not enjoy it. It feels like an insult to everything I loved about the first game, which is why I find it funny when there are articles that report that Kojima redid parts of the game because critics liked it too much. However, what if I told you that I haven't been completely honest with you throughout the video? You see, I've expressed my issues with Death Stranding 2's gameplay, and have asked why Kojima and his development team would make such baffling design choices when in actuality, I've known why the entire time. When I was scripting for the video, I found this one article that said this: Hideo Kojima says Death Stranding 2 is easier than the original because of 2 major drop-off points that stopped players from reaching the end. Essentially, the article explains that the reason behind the lack of difficulty in 2 is due to players from the original dropping the game at certain points because of a difficulty curve. Now first off, the main reason why people dropped it to begin with was not the difficulty, it was the fact that people found it boring. Second of all, Death Stranding 2 is not a difficult game to begin with, so with that in mind, if you make an easy game even easier, then chances are it's not going to be a good game. I find this level of backtracking to be kind of hilarious because of how much he was talking about how he had to change the game around because critics liked Death Stranding 2 too much, only for him to change the game to make it more likable for audiences. I'm also not sure why he would try to change the game around entirely just to please an audience that the game is not made for. You are changing the core mechanics and messaging of your game to please people who weren't willing to give your first game a chance. I can understand this decision from an economic and player-based perspective. However, in doing so, it spreads itself thin with plot points and character arcs that appear to be meaningful on the surface, but often unravel into confusion the longer you think about them. Gameplay designs that have the potential to be great, but end up as baffling, and go against what the first game stands for, with a map that is way bigger than it even needs to be. I'm tired. Death Stranding 2 is one of the most disappointing things I've ever experienced in media. If you like it, then I'm happy that you do. I'm serious. I'm really glad that you're able to enjoy something that I wasn't able to, because I want nothing more than to like this game. I did not go into Death Stranding 2 wanting to hate it. I went in as a fan of the first game, excited to see how Sam's journey would continue, only to be met with a slap in the face. I'm aware that this video is fucking massive, but I needed to air out my frustrations with this game because it has been bugging me ever since its release. So if you're still here, then thank you so much for watching. This was quite a difficult video to make, so if you like what you saw and want to see more, then you should subscribe to my channel. It's the best way that you can support my content, and if you want to be a part of the community, then you should join my Discord. Other than that, take care y'all. I'm going back to sleep, so I'll see y'all again in like 6 months or so.
Wait a second. Cecile Cosima Caminades. Cosima Caminades. Hey, that's close to...
Close to what?
your name. It sounds almost like the sentence, Kojima Caminades, in Japanese.
And what does it mean, s'il vous plaît?
Well, kami is the word for God in Japanese. Nandesu. Well, it's hard to explain, but placed after God, it would turn the sentence into, is God.
Okay, so?
Kojima is God. Cecile's name is a message. I don't believe it. Kojima is God. Kojima is God.